The sun was setting behind the dense forest, casting long, eerie shadows across the narrow, winding road. The golden hues of the evening sky slowly faded into a deep indigo, and a sense of foreboding filled the air. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of tires against asphalt, accompanied by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Reka and Ken, a young couple, were driving through the remote countryside of Japan, returning from a weekend getaway in the mountains. The tranquility of the scenery contrasted sharply with the growing tension in the car. They had been arguing about the route. Ken had chosen a shortcut through an unfamiliar and seemingly endless stretch of highway. Reka glanced at the map on her phone, frowning. "Ken, are you sure this is the right way? We haven't seen another car for over an hour." Ken tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "I'm sure, Reka. This is supposed to be a shortcut. Trust me." But Reka couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. As they continued driving, the road seemed to stretch on indefinitely, each bend leading to another identical stretch of asphalt flanked by towering trees. The darkness deepened, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring their view. Reka turned on the car's headlights, but the fog was so dense that the beams barely penetrated the murkiness. The eerie silence was broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl and the distant howling of a dog. Ken glanced at the fuel gauge and frowned. "We're running low on gas. We need to find a gas station soon." Reka nodded, anxiety creeping into her voice. "But where? There's nothing around here." Just then, they saw a faint light in the distance, a flicker of hope amidst the oppressive darkness. As they drew closer, they saw a small, dilapidated gas station, its sign barely visible through the fog. Relief washed over them as they pulled into the station. Ken got out of the car and walked over to the old pump, while Reka stayed inside, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The place seemed abandoned, the only light coming from a flickering bulb above the entrance to the small shop. Ken tried to pump gas, but nothing happened. He cursed under his breath and walked towards the shop, hoping to find someone inside. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the smell of mildew hit him immediately. The interior was dimly lit, shelves covered in dust and cobwebs. An old man sat behind the counter, his face hidden in the shadows. "Excuse me," Ken called out. "Is the pump working? We're running low on gas." The old man looked up slowly, his eyes gleaming strangely in the dim light. "The pump works," he said in a raspy voice, "but you'll need to pay first." Ken nodded, pulling out his wallet. As he handed over the money, he noticed the man's hands were unusually cold. The old man handed him a rusty key. "Use this to start the pump." Ken took the key and hurried back to the car. He inserted the key into the pump and turned it. The pump roared to life, and he quickly filled the tank. Reka watched him from inside the car, her unease growing. Something about this place felt off. Once the tank was full, Ken returned the key to the old man and hurried back to the car. "Let's get out of here," he said, sliding into the driver's seat. As they pulled away from the gas station, Reka glanced back and saw the old man standing in the doorway, watching them with an unreadable expression. The fog grew thicker as they continued down the highway, and the road seemed to stretch on forever. The sense of unease that had been simmering in the background now felt almost palpable. Reka tried to distract herself by fiddling with the radio, but all she could find was static. Ken's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. They drove in silence for what felt like hours, the monotony of the endless highway pressing down on them. Reka's eyes grew heavy, and she struggled to stay awake. Just as she was about to doze off, she saw something in the fog ahead. "Ken, look!" Ken squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was a figure standing in the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just inches from the figure. It was a woman dressed in white, her long black hair hanging limply around her face. She didn't move, didn't react to the car's headlights shining on her. Rekka's heart pounded in her chest. Who is she? What's she doing out here? Ken shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know. Should we help her? Rekka hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay in the car. But something in the woman's eyes, a pleading, desperate look compelled her to act. She opened the door and stepped out, her breath visible in the cold night air. Are you all right? She called out, her voice trembling. The woman didn't respond, just stood there, staring at her. Ken got out of the car and joined Rekka. Miss, do you need help? The woman finally moved, lifting her head to reveal hollow, empty eyes. Rekka gasped, stepping back. Ken, something's not right. Ken reached out, trying to touch the woman's arm. But his hand passed right through her. He stumbled back, his face pale. Geez, she's not real. The woman opened her mouth, and a chilling wail filled the air. The fog thickened, swirling around them, and the temperature dropped sharply. Rekka and Ken scrambled back into the car, slamming the doors shut. Ken floored the accelerator, the tires screeching as they sped away. The woman's wail followed them, growing louder and more desperate. The road seemed to twist and turn, the fog distorting their surroundings. Rekka clutched the seat, her knuckles white. Ken, we need to get off this road. Now. Ken nodded, his eyes wild with fear. But no matter how many turns they took, the road never changed. It was as if they were trapped in a never-ending loop. The woman's wail faded into the distance, but the sense of dread lingered. Rekka glanced at the clock on the dashboard, but the numbers were jumbled, meaningless. Ken, what's happening? This can't be real. Ken shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know, Rekka. I don't know. As they drove on, the road seemed to stretch into infinity, the fog, thickening with every passing moment. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, the fear overwhelming them. The headlights of the car barely penetrated the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows that danced on the edges of their vision. Suddenly, the car sputtered and the engine died. Ken cursed, frantically turning the key, but the engine wouldn't start. Rekka's heart raced, panic setting in. What do we do now? Ken shook his head, his face pale and drenched in sweat. I don't know. I don't know. They sat in silence, the oppressive darkness closing in around them. The fog seemed to seep into the car, chilling them to the bone. Just as they were about to give up hope, they saw headlights approaching from the opposite direction. A car was coming towards them. Ken and Rekka waved frantically, desperate for help. The car slowed down and stopped beside them. The driver, a middle-aged man, rolled down his window. Are you two all right? Ken nodded, relief flooding his face. Our car broke down. Can you help us? The man nodded. Sure. Hop in. I'll give you a ride to the nearest town. Ken and Rekka grabbed their belongings and got into the stranger's car. As they drove away, Rekka glanced back at their car, now barely visible through the fog. The sense of unease lingered, but for the first time in hours, they felt a glimmer of hope. The man's car was warm, the hum of the engine soothing. He introduced himself as Mr. Tanaka, a local who knew the area well. You two are lucky I came along, he said, glancing at them in the rearview mirror. This road can be dangerous at night. Rekka and Ken exchanged uneasy glances. What do you mean? Ken asked. Mr. Tanaka's expression grew serious. Many people have gone missing on this road. They say it's cursed. Rekka's heart skipped a beat. Cursed? Mr. Tanaka nodded. There's a legend about a woman who died here many years ago. They say her spirit haunts the highway, trapping anyone who ventures too far. Ken's face paled. We saw her. Mr. Tanaka's eyes widened. You saw her? Rekka nodded, her voice trembling. She was standing in the middle of the road. We almost hit her. Mr. Tanaka's grip on the steering wheel tightened. You're lucky to be alive. Most people who see her never make it out. The rest of the drive was filled with tense silence, the weight of Mr. Tanaka's words hanging over them. They finally reached a small town, its lights a welcome sight after the endless darkness. Mr. Tanaka dropped them off at a local inn, refusing to take any money for his trouble. "Just be careful," he said as they got out of the car, "and stay away from that highway." Reka and Ken checked into the inn, grateful for the warmth and safety of their room. But the events of the night weighed heavily on their minds. As they lay in bed, Reka couldn't shake the image of the woman's hollow eyes, her chilling wail echoing in her ears. Ken stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. "Reka, what do we do now?" Reka turned to him, her expression determined. "We need to find out what happened on that road. We need to understand the curse." Ken nodded, his fear giving way to resolve. "You're right. We can't just forget about this." The next morning, they set out to uncover the truth behind the legend. They spoke to locals, visited the town's library, and pieced together the story of the woman who had died on the highway. Her name was Yuki, a young bride, who had been killed in a tragic accident on her wedding night. Her spirit, filled with grief and anger, had become trapped on the highway, luring unsuspecting travelers to their doom. Reka and Ken realized they had narrowly escaped a similar fate. They decided to hold a memorial for Yuki, hoping to put her spirit to rest. They returned to the highway, armed with offerings and prayers. As they stood by the side of the road, they felt a cold wind blow through them, and the fog began to lift. For a moment, they saw Yuki standing before them, her expression softening as they offered their respects. The air grew warmer, the oppressive darkness dissipating. Reka and Ken knew they had done the right thing. They left the highway behind, vowing never to return. But the memory of that night would stay with them forever, a chilling reminder of the power of the supernatural. As they drove away, the road seemed less menacing, the shadows less threatening. They had faced their fear and come out the other side, forever changed by their encounter with the endless highway. The sun rose slowly over the small town, casting a golden glow on the quaint houses and narrow streets. Reka and Ken sat at a wooden table in the inn's cozy dining room, sipping hot tea and discussing their plan for the day. The events of the previous night were still fresh in their minds, and a heavy sense of responsibility hung over them. "We need to find out everything we can about Yuki," Reka said, her voice determined. Ken nodded, his eyes scanning the room, as if expecting the ghost to appear at any moment. "We should start with the local library. Maybe there's something in the town's records about her." After finishing their breakfast, they headed to the library, a small building nestled between two larger ones on the main street. The librarian, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Takahashi, greeted them warmly. "How can I help you today?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. Reka explained their situation, carefully omitting the supernatural details. "We're researching a woman named Yuki who lived here many years ago. She died in a car accident on the highway." Mrs. Takahashi's expression grew serious. "Ah, Yuki. I remember hearing stories about her when I was a child. Such a tragic tale." She led them to a section of the library, filled with old newspapers and town records. "This is where you'll find what you're looking for," she said, patting a dusty shelf. Reka and Ken spent the next several hours sifting through the yellowed pages, piecing together Yuki's story. They discovered that she had been a beloved member of the community, known for her kindness and beauty. Her wedding had been the event of the year, but tragedy struck on the way to the reception when her car skidded off the road in the thick fog. The details of the accident were chillingly similar to their own experience on the highway. As they read, a pattern began to emerge. Other accidents had occurred on the same stretch of road, all under similar circumstances. It was as if the highway itself was cursed, claiming the lives of those who ventured too far. Reka and Ken exchanged uneasy glances. "We need to talk to someone who knew her," Ken said, closing the book he had been reading. "Someone who can tell us more about what happened that night." Mrs. Takahashi overheard their conversation and approached them. "If you're looking for someone who knew Yuki well, you should speak to Mr. Nakamura. He was a close friend of her family." She gave them directions to his house, a small cottage on the outskirts of town. They thanked her and set off, the weight of their mission heavy on their shoulders. Mr. Nakamura's house was a modest, traditional Japanese home, surrounded by a well-tended garden. The elderly man greeted them at the door, his face lined with age and wisdom. Mrs. Takahashi had called ahead to let him know they were coming, and he welcomed them inside with a nod. They sat in his living room, the walls adorned with family photos and mementos from a long, fulfilling life. "Yuki was like a daughter to me," Mr. Nakamura said, his voice tinged with sadness. "Her death was a great loss to all of us." Reka and Ken listened intently as he recounted stories of Yuki's childhood, her laughter, and the joy she brought to those around her. But when he spoke of her death, his expression grew dark. "The night she died, there was something strange," he said, his voice lowering to a whisper. "The fog was unnaturally thick, and there were no other cars on the road. It was as if the highway itself had swallowed her up." Reka and Ken exchanged a glance, their suspicion confirmed. "Do you believe the road is cursed?" Reka asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Nakamura sighed, his eyes distant. "I don't know what to believe, but I do know that many have suffered the same fate as Yuki. It's as if her spirit is trying to warn others to keep them from meeting the same end." They thanked Mr. Nakamura for his time and left, their minds buzzing with questions and possibilities. As they walked back to their car, Ken turned to Rika. "We need to find a way to put her spirit to rest, to break the curse once and for all." Rika nodded, determination hardening her features. "Let's visit the site of the accident. Maybe there's something there that can help us." The drive to the highway was tense, the memory of their encounter with Yuki fresh in their minds. They parked near the spot where the accident had occurred, the road eerily silent in the midday sun. Reka and Ken stepped out of the car and walked to the edge of the highway, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of the supernatural. The air was still, the only sound the distant hum of cicadas. As they stood there, a sudden chill swept over them, and the fog began to roll in once more. Rika's heart raced as she felt a presence nearby. "Ken, do you feel that?" Ken nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "It's her." They turned to see Yuki standing on the road, her expression a mix of sorrow and desperation. Rika took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Yuki, we want to help you. We want to put your spirit to rest." Yuki's eyes locked onto Rika's, and for a moment, the fog seemed to thicken, the air growing colder. But then something changed. Yuki's expression softened, and she raised her hand, pointing towards a small shrine hidden among the trees by the side of the road. Rika and Ken followed her gaze and saw the shrine, its wood weathered and ancient. They approached it cautiously, the air around them heavy with anticipation. The shrine was simple, adorned with faded flowers and offerings from years past. As they knelt before it, Rika felt a sense of peace wash over her. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, hoping to reach Yuki's spirit. Ken joined her, their voices blending into a harmonious plea for forgiveness and release. The fog began to lift, the oppressive atmosphere dissipating. When they opened their eyes, Yuki was gone, her presence replaced by a sense of calm. Rika and Ken stood, feeling a weight lifted from their shoulders. They had done what they could to honor Yuki's memory and hoped it would be enough to break the curse. As they drove back to the inn, the sun setting behind them, they felt a sense of closure. The road no longer seemed menacing, the shadows less threatening. But they knew they would never forget their encounter with the endless highway and the ghosts who had guided them to the truth. The next day, they decided to visit the town's temple to speak with the priests. They wanted to ensure that Yuki's spirit was at peace and that the curse had truly been lifted. The temple was a serene place, its gardens meticulously maintained, and the air filled with the scent of incense. The The priest, a wise and gentle man named Father Sato, welcomed them and listened to their story with a thoughtful expression. "You have done a great service for Yuki's spirit," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "But to truly ensure her peace, we must perform a purification ceremony." Reka and Ken agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. They helped Father Sato prepare for the ceremony, gathering offerings and arranging the sacred space. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the temple, they stood before the altar, their hearts filled with hope. Father Sato began the ceremony, his chants echoing through the temple grounds. The air grew thick with spiritual energy, and Reka and Ken felt a sense of connection to Yuki's spirit. As the ceremony reached its climax, they saw a vision of Yuki, her expression peaceful and serene. She bowed to them, a gesture of gratitude and farewell. Reka and Ken felt tears in their eyes, their hearts heavy with emotion. The ceremony concluded, and Father Sato smiled at them. "Yuki's spirit is at peace now. You have done well." They thanked him and left the temple, feeling a sense of closure and fulfillment. Their journey had been difficult and frightening, but they had faced their fears and come out stronger. As they drove away from the town, the road ahead seemed bright and inviting, free of the darkness that had plagued them. They knew they would always carry the memory of Yuki and the endless highway with them, a reminder of the power of love and the importance of honoring the past. Reka and Ken returned to their lives, forever changed by their experience. They shared their story with others, hoping to prevent anyone else from suffering the same fate. And in the quiet moments of their lives, they would think of Yuki and the peace they had helped her find. The endless highway was no longer a place of fear, but a testament to the enduring power of compassion and understanding. Reka and Ken had faced the unknown and emerged victorious, their bonds stronger than ever. As they looked to the future, they knew they could face any challenge together, guided by the lessons they had learned on that fateful road. The night had settled over the small town like a heavy blanket, the moon casting a pale glow on the quiet streets. Reka and Ken returned to their inn, exhausted from their day of research and the emotional toll of the purification ceremony. The weight of their journey still hung heavily on them, but there was a flicker of hope that they had done the right thing. Inside their room, the atmosphere was somber yet peaceful. Reka sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the darkened landscape. "I still can't believe everything that's happened," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Ken sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know, it feels like a dream or maybe a nightmare, but we did the right thing. Yuki is at peace now." Reka nodded, but her mind was still restless. She couldn't shake the feeling that their journey wasn't quite over. The memory of Yuki's hollow eyes and the chilling wail on the highway haunted her thoughts. "Ken, what if there's more to this? What if we missed something?" Ken sighed, his own fatigue evident in his voice. "We've done everything we could. We honored her memory. We performed the purification ceremony. What more can we do?" Reka stood up, pacing the room. "I don't know, but I feel like there's something we haven't uncovered yet, something that ties everything together." Ken watched her, concern etched on his face. "We can't keep digging forever, Reka. At some point, we have to let go." Reka stopped, turning to face him. "But what if letting go means someone else falls victim to the curse? What if there's another way to stop it for good?" Ken stood up and walked over to her, taking her hands in his. "We'll figure it out together. But for now, we need rest. We've been through a lot and we need to recharge." Reka nodded, though the unease still gnawed at her. She knew Ken was right, but the unanswered questions lingered in the back of her mind. They lay down together, the fatigue of their ordeal finally catching up to them. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of foggy highways and ghostly apparitions. Morning came all too soon, the light of dawn filtering through the curtains. Reka awoke with a start, her heart pounding from a nightmare she couldn't quite remember. Ken stirred beside her, groaning as he sat up. "Another restless night?" Reka nodded, rubbing her eyes. Yeah, I can't shake this feeling, Ken. Something's still not right. Ken sighed, running a hand through his hair. Let's go for a walk. Clear our heads. Maybe we'll find some clarity. They dressed quickly and headed out into the crisp morning air. The town was just beginning to wake up, shopkeepers opening their doors and early roses strolling along the streets. The quiet beauty of the morning was a stark contrast to the darkness that had enveloped their journey so far. As they walked, they found themselves drawn to the outskirts of town, where the dense forest loomed. The highway that had brought them so much terror was just beyond the trees, a silent reminder of their ordeal. Rekka stopped, her eyes fixed on the forest. Ken, I think we need to go back to the place where it all started. Ken frowned, his brow furrowing in concern. You mean the highway? Why? Rekka took a deep breath, steeling herself. I don't know, but I feel like we missed something important, something that can help us understand the curse. Ken hesitated, then nodded. All right, but we need to be careful. We don't know what we might find. They turned back towards the highway, the path through the forest eerily quiet. As they walked, the trees seemed to close in around them, the sunlight barely penetrating the thick canopy. The sense of unease grew with every step, the memory of Yuki's ghostly figure haunting their thoughts. When they finally reached the highway, the sight of the deserted road sent a chill down their spines. The fog that had plagued them before was gone, but the air was still heavy with a sense of foreboding. Rekka and Ken stood at the edge of the road, staring into the distance. Do you feel that? Rekka whispered, her voice trembling. Ken nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. Yeah, it's like the air is charged with something dark. They walked along the highway, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The memories of their previous encounters with Yuki's spirit were vivid in their minds, each step a reminder of the terror they had faced as they approached the spot where the accident had occurred. Rekka's heart began to race. She could almost see the ghostly figure of Yuki standing there, her eyes filled with sorrow and desperation. Ken, look! Ken followed her gaze, his eyes widening. There, by the side of the road, was the small shrine they had visited before. But something was different. The offerings they had placed were gone, replaced by new ones. Fresh flowers, incense, and a small wooden plaque inscribed with a name. Someone's been here, Ken said, his voice low. Rekka nodded, her mind racing. But who and why? As they approached the shrine, a figure stepped out from behind the trees. An elderly woman, her face lined with age and wisdom, stood before them. Her eyes were kind, but there was a depth of sorrow in them that mirrored Yuki's. You must be the ones who tried to help Yuki, the woman said, her voice soft yet firm. Rekka and Ken exchanged a glance, then nodded. Yes, Rekka said. We performed a purification ceremony to put her spirit to rest. The woman smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. I know. I felt the change in the air, but there is still more to be done. Rekka frowned, her heart sinking. What do you mean? We thought we had ended the curse. The woman shook her head. The curse is deeper than you realize. It is not just Yuki's spirit that haunts this highway. There are others, victims of the same tragedy that claimed her life. Ken's eyes widened. Others? You mean there are more spirits trapped here? The woman nodded. Yes, the highway is a place of sorrow, a place where many lives have been lost. The curse binds their spirits, trapping them in an endless cycle of pain. Rekka's mind raced, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what the woman was saying. How can we help them? What can we do to break the curse? The woman stepped closer, her eyes piercing through Rekka's. You must find the source of the curse, the one who first brought this darkness to the highway. Only then can you free the trapped spirits and end the cycle. Ken's face hardened with determination. Where do we start? How do we find this source? The woman pointed to the forest beyond the highway. There is an old shrine deep within the woods. It is said to be the origin of the curse. You must go there and confront the darkness that resides within. Rekka and Ken exchanged a glance, their resolve firming. "Thank you," Rekka said, her voice filled with gratitude. "We will do whatever it takes to end this." The woman nodded, her expression softening. "Be careful. The path is treacherous and the darkness within the shrine is powerful. But I believe you have the strength to overcome it." With those words, she turned and walked back into the forest, leaving Rekka and Ken standing by the highway. They took a deep breath, steeling themselves for the journey ahead. The path through the forest was overgrown and difficult to navigate, the underbrush thick and unyielding. The air grew colder the deeper they ventured, the sunlight barely penetrating the dense canopy above. As they walked, the sense of unease grew stronger, the darkness closing in around them. Rekka could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on her, the sorrow and pain of the trapped spirit seeping into her very soul. "Ken, do you feel that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ken nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, it's like the air is getting thicker. We're getting close." They pushed forward, their determination unwavering, despite the fear that gnawed at them. After what felt like hours, they finally reached a clearing. In the center stood an ancient shrine, its wood weathered and covered in moss. The air around it was heavy with a palpable sense of malevolence. Rekka and Ken approached the shrine cautiously, their hearts pounding in their chests. The darkness that emanated from the shrine was almost tangible, a thick, oppressive presence that seemed to wrap around them. "This is it," Rekka whispered, her voice barely audible. Ken nodded, his eyes fixed on the shrine. "Let's end this." They knelt before the shrine, their hands clasped in prayer. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in on them from all sides. As they prayed, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the small flame of the offering candle. Rekka and Ken opened their eyes, their hearts racing. Before them stood a figure shrouded in darkness. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, its presence filling the air with a sense of dread. "You have come to end the curse," the figure hissed, its voice echoing through the clearing. Rekka and Ken stood their ground, their resolve unshaken. "Yes," Rekka said, her voice strong. "We have come to free the trapped spirits and end this cycle of pain." The figure laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down their spines. "You think you can defeat me? I am the darkness that binds this place. The pain and sorrow of countless souls give me strength." Ken stepped forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "We will do whatever it takes to break the curse. We won't let you continue this cycle of suffering." The figure's eyes narrowed, its form shifting and writhing. "Very well. But know this: the darkness is not easily defeated. You must face your deepest fears and confront the pain within yourselves if you hope to succeed." With those words, the figure vanished, leaving Rekka and Ken alone in the clearing. The oppressive darkness lifted slightly, but the air was still heavy with the weight of the curse. "We can do this," Rekka said, her voice filled with conviction. "We have to." Ken nodded, his eyes shining with determination. Together, they knelt once more before the shrine, their hearts and minds focused on their goal. As they prayed, the air around them grew colder, the darkness closing in once more. But this time, they were ready. They felt the presence of the trapped spirits, their pain and sorrow washing over them. But instead of being overwhelmed, they drew strength from their resolve to end the suffering. As their prayers intensified, the darkness began to waver, its grip on the shrine weakening. Rekka and Ken could feel the spirit's pain transforming into a sense of peace, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. The figure of darkness reappeared, its form flickering and unstable. "You cannot defeat me," it hissed, its voice filled with desperation. Rekka stood, her eyes blazing with determination. "We already have." With those words, the darkness shattered, the oppressive presence dissipating into the air. The clearing was filled with a sense of peace and tranquility. The weight of the curse lifted. Rekka and Ken stood together, their hearts filled with relief and triumph. They had faced their deepest fears and emerged victorious, breaking the cycle of suffering that had plagued the highway for so long. As they walked back through the forest, the sunlight breaking through the canopy, they felt a renewed sense of hope and purpose. The memory of Yuki and the other trapped spirits would stay with them, a reminder of the power of compassion and determination. They had faced the darkness within and emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. And as they left the forest behind, they knew they could face any challenge that lay ahead together. The quiet town of Kiyomizu seemed peaceful as dawn broke, casting a soft glow over its streets and homes. Reka and Ken awoke in their inn, the events of the previous day still fresh in their minds. Despite the sense of triumph they felt from breaking the curse, an underlying tension remained. Something told them their journey wasn't quite over. After breakfast, they walked through the town, their thoughts heavy. The memory of the dark figure at the shrine lingered, a haunting reminder of the curse they had faced. As they passed the small shops and homes, they felt the eyes of the townspeople upon them. Word of their actions had spread, and they were met with a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. "We need to go back to the shrine," Reka said, breaking the silence. Ken nodded, understanding her resolve. "There might be something we've missed, something that can give us closure." The path through the forest was familiar now, but the sense of unease never quite left them. The trees loomed overhead, their branches casting long shadows on the ground. The air was cool and crisp, the scent of pine and earth filling their lungs. When they reached the shrine, the atmosphere felt different. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by a sense of tranquility. Yet, the shrine itself seemed to hold a secret, something hidden just beneath the surface. Reka and Ken knelt before the shrine, their hearts open and their minds focused. They closed their eyes, allowing themselves to be fully present in the moment. As they prayed, they felt a shift in the air, a subtle change that hinted at something just out of reach. Suddenly, Reka opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the small wooden plaque they had seen before. It was inscribed with a name, but in the dim light, they hadn't been able to read it clearly. Now, with the morning sun casting a gentle glow, she could make out the characters. "Ken, look at this," she said, her voice trembling. Ken leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he read the name. "Haruto. That's Yuki's brother's name." Reka nodded, her mind racing. Why would his name be on this plaque? What does it mean? Ken's expression grew serious. "There's only one way to find out. We need to speak to Mr. Nakamura again. He might know something we don't." They hurried back to the town, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Mr. Nakamura welcomed them into his home, his eyes filled with concern as he listened to their story. "Haruto," he murmured, his voice heavy with emotion. "I had hoped it wouldn't come to this." Reka and Ken exchanged a glance, their anxiety growing. "What do you mean?" Reka asked. Mr. Nakamura sighed, his gaze distant. Haruto was deeply affected by Yuki's death. He blamed himself for not being there to protect her. The guilt consumed him, and he became obsessed with finding a way to bring her back. Ken's eyes widened in realization. He tried to reverse the curse. Mr. Nakamura nodded. Yes, he believed that if he could summon the spirit of the dark figure that haunted the highway, he could bargain with it to release Yuki's spirit. But instead, he became entangled in the curse himself. Reka's heart ached with sympathy. "So Haruto's spirit is trapped as well?" Mr. Nakamura's expression was solemn. "Yes, and as long as his spirit remains bound by the curse, Yuki and the other spirits cannot find true peace." Ken's resolve hardened. "We have to free Haruto. It's the only way to end this once and for all." Mr. Nakamura nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, but be careful. The dark figure is powerful, and it will not let go easily." Reka and Ken returned to the shrine, their hearts heavy with the weight of their new mission. They knelt before the shrine once more, their prayers focused on Haruto's spirit. As the air grew colder and the atmosphere darkened, they felt a presence surrounding them. The dark figure appeared, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "You have returned," it hissed, its voice echoing through the clearing. Rekka and Ken stood their ground, their resolve unwavering. "We know the truth," Rekka said, her voice strong. "We know about Haruto. Release his spirit and end this curse." The figure laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down their spines. "You think you can command me? I am the darkness that binds this place. Haruto's spirit belongs to me." Ken stepped forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "We won't leave until he's free. We'll do whatever it takes." The figure's eyes narrowed, its form shifting and writhing. "Very well. But know this: freeing Haruto's spirit will come at a great cost." Rekka and Ken exchanged a glance, their hearts filled with fear and determination. "What do we have to do?" Rekka asked, her voice trembling. The figure's form solidified, its eyes piercing through them. "You must face the darkness within yourselves. Only then will you have the strength to break the curse." Rekka and Ken nodded, their resolve firm. They closed their eyes, allowing themselves to be fully immersed in the moment. As they stood before the shrine, the darkness around them deepened, enveloping them in its cold embrace. The air grew thick with tension, and they felt a weight pressing down on their hearts. Rekka's mind was filled with images of Yuki's sorrowful eyes and Haruto's guilt-ridden face. She felt their pain as if it were her own, the weight of their emotions pressing down on her chest. Ken's thoughts were consumed by the memory of their encounters with the dark figure, the fear and despair it had instilled in them. He felt the weight of his own guilt and fear, the darkness within him threatening to overwhelm him. As they faced their deepest fears and insecurities, they felt a shift in the air. The darkness around them began to waver, its grip on their hearts weakening. Rekka and Ken opened their eyes, their gazes locked on the dark figure before them. "We will not let you continue this cycle of suffering," Rekka said, her voice filled with conviction. "We will free Haruto's spirit and end this curse." The figure's eyes blazed with fury, its form flickering and unstable. "You cannot defeat me," it hissed, its voice filled with desperation. Ken stepped forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "We already have." With those words, the darkness shattered, the oppressive presence dissipating into the air. The clearing was filled with a sense of peace and tranquility. The weight of the curse lifted. Before them stood Haruto's spirit, his eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You have freed me from the darkness." Rekka and Ken felt tears in their eyes, their hearts heavy with emotion. "We couldn't have done it without you," Rekka said, her voice trembling. "Your love for Yuki gave us the strength to face the darkness." Haruto's spirit bowed to them, a gesture of gratitude and farewell. As his form faded into the air, they felt a sense of closure and fulfillment. They had faced their deepest fears and emerged victorious, breaking the cycle of suffering that had plagued the highway for so long. As they walked back through the forest, the sunlight breaking through the canopy, they felt a renewed sense of hope and purpose. The memory of Yuki, Haruto, and the other trapped spirits would stay with them, a reminder of the power of compassion and determination. They had faced the darkness within and emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. And as they left the forest behind, they knew they could face any challenge that lay ahead together. Rekka and Ken returned to the town, their hearts filled with a sense of accomplishment and peace. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the winding mountain road. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine, and the promise of a cold night. The dense forest on either side of the road seemed to close in, creating a tunnel of shadows. In the dimming light, the asphalt appeared almost black, and the white lane markers gleamed like ghostly specters. Yuki and Hiroshi had been driving for hours. They were on their way to a remote cabin that Yuki's family owned. seeking a weekend of relaxation away from the city's chaos. Yuki, a slender woman with short, dark hair, sat in the passenger seat, studying the map on her phone. Hiroshi, a sturdy man with a calm demeanor, focused on the road ahead. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind shared by people who know each other well. As they passed mile marker 13, a thick fog began to roll in, creeping over the road like a living entity. The headlights of their car cut through the mist, but visibility was rapidly diminishing. Yuki glanced up from her phone, her brow furrowing. "This fog came out of nowhere," she remarked, a hint of unease in her voice. Hiroshi nodded, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "Yeah, it's strange. The weather forecast didn't mention anything about fog." The fog grew denser with each passing moment, swallowing the trees and the road ahead. The world outside the car became an indistinct blur of grey and white. Hiroshi slowed the car to a crawl, his eyes straining to see more than a few feet in front of them. "We should pull over," Yuki suggested. "It's too dangerous to keep driving like this." Hiroshi nodded in agreement. He carefully guided the car to the side of the road and turned on the hazard lights. The thick fog enveloped them, muting the sounds of the forest and the occasional passing car. It felt as though they were in a world of their own, isolated from everything else. Yuki shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. "This fog is creepy. It's almost unnatural." Hiroshi reached over and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "We'll wait it out. It should clear up soon." They sat in silence, the fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. The tension in the car was palpable, an unspoken fear that something was wrong. Hiroshi turned on the radio, hoping to find some news or distraction. But all they got was static. "Great," he muttered, switching it off. "No signal out here." Yuki peered into the fog, her eyes narrowing. "Did you see that?" Hiroshi followed her gaze, but saw nothing but swirling mist. "See what?" There was something out there, a shape moving through the fog. Hiroshi felt a chill run down his spine. Probably just an animal. The forest is full of them. Yuki didn't look convinced. It didn't look like an animal. It was too human. Hiroshi swallowed hard, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up his spine. "Let's just stay in the car and wait. It's safer." The fog seemed to grow thicker, if that were possible, and the world outside the car became even more obscure. Yuki kept her eyes fixed on the window, watching for any signs of movement. Hiroshi glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It had only been 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from the back of the car. Both Yuki and Hiroshi jumped, their hearts racing. Hiroshi quickly turned around, but all he could see was the dense fog, pressing against the rear window. "What was that?" Yuki whispered, her voice trembling. Hiroshi shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know. Stay here. I'll check it out." "No," Yuki grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't go out there. It's too dangerous." Hiroshi hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect and the rational fear of the unknown. "We need to know what it is. It could be someone in trouble." Reluctantly, Yuki let go of his arm. "Be careful." Hiroshi nodded and opened the car door, stepping out into the thick, oppressive fog. The cold air bit into his skin, and he shivered as he made his way to the back of the car. The fog seemed to swallow him whole, reducing his visibility to almost nothing. He felt around, his hands trembling, but found nothing unusual. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard a faint whispering sound, barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. He strained to listen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, and he realized it was not just one voice, but many, overlapping and indistinct. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding small and frightened in the thick fog. There was no response, just the incessant whispering. He took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to return to the safety of the car. As he turned, he caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure moving through the fog, its form indistinct and ghostly. "Hiroshi," Yuki's voice cut through the fog filled with panic. He didn't need any more urging. He bolted back to the car, flinging the door open and jumping inside. He slammed the door shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "What did you see?" Yuki demanded, her eyes wide with fear. "There was someone out there," Hiroshi panted. "Or something. I couldn't see it clearly." Yuki's face paled. "We need to get out of here." Hiroshi nodded, starting the car. The engine roared to life, but the fog was so thick that he could barely see the road. He put the car in gear and slowly began to drive, the headlights cutting through the fog like knives. As they drove, the whispering seemed to follow them, growing louder and more insistent. Hiroshi's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Yuki kept looking over her shoulder, her fear palpable. "Faster, Hiroshi," she urged, her voice trembling. "We need to get away from here." Hiroshi pressed the accelerator, but the fog was so dense that he couldn't go much faster without risking an accident. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening, and he could feel a cold sweat trickling down his back. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. Illuminated by the headlights, Hiroshi swerved to avoid it, the car skidding on the wet asphalt. They came to a screeching halt, the figure vanishing into the fog. Yuki screamed, her hands covering her face. "What was that?" Hiroshi's heart pounded in his chest. "I don't know. It looked like a person." They sat in the car, the engine idling, the fog pressing in on them from all sides. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was almost worse. "We can't stay here," Yuki said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to keep moving." Hiroshi nodded, putting the car back in gear. They continued down the road, the fog still thick and oppressive. The further they went, the more it felt like they were driving into a nightmare from which there was no escape. As they approached a bend in the road, the fog began to thin slightly, and they saw a dim light ahead. It was a small, roadside shrine, its lantern flickering in the foggy night. Hiroshi pulled the car over, and they both got out, drawn to the light like moths to a flame. The shrine was old and weathered, its wooden beams covered in moss. The lantern cast long shadows, giving the place an otherworldly feel. Yuki and Hiroshi exchanged a look, their fear momentarily replaced by curiosity. "Let's take a look," Yuki suggested, her voice hushed. Hiroshi nodded, and they approached the shrine, the fog swirling around them. As they reached the entrance, they saw a small, carved plaque with an inscription. It read, "Beware the spirits that haunt mile marker 13. They are restless and seek the living." A chill ran down their spines as they read the words. Yuki turned to Hiroshi, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave now." Hiroshi didn't argue. They hurried back to the car and drove away from the shrine. The fog slowly beginning to lift, the whispering had stopped, replaced by an uneasy silence that seemed to follow them. They drove in silence, the tension slowly easing as the fog thinned and the road became clearer. By the time they reached the cabin, the fog had completely dissipated, leaving only the memory of their terrifying encounter. As they settled into the cabin, neither Yuki nor Hiroshi could shake the feeling that something had followed them. The events of the night replayed in their minds, a chilling reminder of the unknown horrors that lurked in the fog over mile marker 13. Yuki and Hiroshi sat in the dimly lit cabin, their nerves still on edge from the night's harrowing encounter. The cabin, nestled deep in the forest, was a stark contrast to the chairs of their drive. It was a cozy retreat with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and simple furnishings. Yet, the tranquility did little to dispel the lingering fear. Yuki, her hands trembling slightly, lit a fire in the fireplace. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, providing a small measure of comfort. Hiroshi sat at the small dining table, staring out the window into the dark forest beyond. The fog had lifted, but the memory of the whispering, voices and shadowy figures still haunted him. "We need to figure out what happened," Yuki said, breaking the silence. Hiroshi nodded, his expression grim. "I don't think it was just our imagination. There was something out there." Yuki shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I know. But what? And why did it target us?" Hiroshi sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know. But we need to be careful. We don't know if it's still following us." Yuki nodded, her fear palpable. "Maybe we should leave. Find another place to stay for the night." Hiroshi shook his head. "We can't drive in this state. We're both too rattled, and the roads are dangerous at night. We'll have to wait until morning." Yuki reluctantly agreed, though the thought of staying in the cabin, for the night filled her with dread. The hours dragged on, the oppressive silence, only broken by the occasional crackle of the fire. Yuki and Hiroshi tried to distract themselves, but the unease lingered like a shadow. As the night wore on, they decided to sleep in shifts, each taking turns to keep watch. Hiroshi took the first shift, sitting by the window with a flashlight, his eyes scanning the dark forest. Yuki lay on the couch, trying to rest, but unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched. Sometime after midnight, Hiroshi heard the faint whispering that had plagued them on the road. He tensed, straining to hear, but the sound was elusive, like a breeze rustling through the leaves. He turned off the flashlight, hoping to get a better sense of direction, but the whispering seemed to come from all around. Yuki stirred in her sleep, mumbling something incoherent. Hiroshi moved to her side, gently shaking her awake. "Yuki, wake up. I hear it again." Yuki woke with a start, her eyes wide with fear. "What?" The whispering. Hiroshi nodded, his face pale. "Yes, it's out there." They listened in silence, the whispering growing louder, more insistent. It was a cacophony of voices, overlapping and indistinct, filling the room with an eerie presence. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door, causing both of them to jump. Yuki clutched Hiroshi's arm, her heart pounding. Who could that be at this hour? Hiroshi shook his head, moving cautiously toward the door. "I don't know. Stay behind me." He peered through the peephole, but the fog outside was too thick to see anything clearly. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. There was no answer, just the continued whispering. He took a deep breath and opened the door. A crack, shining his flashlight into the fog. There was no one there. He stepped outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. "Hello?" The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. He scanned the area with his flashlight, but saw nothing. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard a soft sobbing sound coming from the edge of the forest. "Hiroshi," Yuki whispered urgently. "Come back inside." But Hiroshi was drawn to the sound, compelled to investigate. He moved toward the forest, the sobbing growing louder, more desperate. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. He reached the tree line and saw a figure huddled on the ground, its form obscured by the fog. "Are you okay?" he asked, approaching cautiously. The figure looked up, and Hiroshi's blood ran cold. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Hiroshi hesitated, fear warring with compassion. "What's wrong? What happened to you?" The woman reached out a trembling hand. "They're coming for me. Please, you have to help me." Hiroshi felt a chill run down his spine. "Who's coming for you?" Before she could answer, the whispering started again, louder and more aggressive. The woman screamed, a blood-curdling sound that sent Hiroshi stumbling back. "Yuki, help!" he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the fog. The woman vanished, her screams echoing through the forest. Hiroshi ran back to the cabin, his heart pounding. "Yuki, we need to leave. Now." Yuki was already by the door, her face pale with fear. What happened? Who was that? I don't know, Hiroshi said, grabbing their bags. But we can't stay here. It's not safe. They hurriedly packed their belongings and rushed to the car. As they drove away from the cabin, the whispering followed them, growing fainter with each passing mile. They didn't stop until they reached a small roadside inn several miles away. Exhausted and shaken, they checked into a room, grateful for the relative safety. As they settled in, Yuki turned to Hiroshi, her eyes filled with fear and determination. We need to find out what happened at mile marker 13, she said. This isn't over. Hiroshi nodded, his face set with resolve. Agreed. We need to know the truth. The next morning, they set out to investigate, determined to uncover the mystery behind the haunting. They drove back to the area, their nerves still raw, but their determination stronger than ever. They started by visiting the local library, hoping to find any information about the history of the area. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, listened to their story with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Mile marker 13, she said, her voice tinged with unease. There are many stories about that place. Some say it's cursed. Yuki and Hiroshi exchanged a glance. What kind of stories? Hiroshi asked. The librarian sighed, pulling out a dusty old book. There have been reports of strange occurrences there for decades. People disappearing, strange lights, voices in the fog. Some say it's the spirits of those who died on that stretch of road. Yuki shivered. Do you know if anyone has investigated these claims? The librarian nodded. A few years ago, a group of paranormal researchers came through. They claimed to have found evidence of supernatural activity, but they left abruptly and never returned. Hiroshi leaned forward, his interest piqued. Do you know how we can contact them? The librarian shook her head. I'm afraid not, but there is one person who might be able to help. An old man who lives near mile marker 13. He's lived there all his life and knows more about the area than anyone else. Yuki and Hiroshi thanked the librarian and set out to find the old man. The drive was tense, the memory of the previous night's encounter still fresh in their minds. They reached a small, dilapidated house near mile marker 13, its windows dark and its roof sagging. An old man sat on the porch, whittling a piece of wood. He looked up as they approached, his eyes sharp and wary. Can I help you? He asked, his voice gruff. Yuki and Hiroshi introduced themselves and explained their situation. The old man listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he nodded slowly. I've heard those whispers too, seen the shadows. You're not the first to come seeking answers. Do you know what's causing it? Hiroshi asked. The old man sighed, setting down his carving. It's the spirits of the restless dead, those who died in accidents on this road. They can't move on, trapped by their unfinished business. Yuki's eyes widened. Is there any way to help them? The old man shook his head. I don't know, but I do know this: they won't stop until their stories are told, until someone understands their pain. Hiroshi and Yuki exchanged a determined look. We'll do whatever it takes, Hiroshi said. We need to find out what happened and help them move on. The old man nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and respect. Then you'll need to dig deep. Find the records, talk to the families. Only then will you begin to understand. With the old man's guidance, Yuki and Hiroshi began their investigation in earnest. They scoured old newspapers, searched through public records, and interviewed locals who had lived in the area for years. Slowly, they pieced together a tragic story of lives cut short and unresolved grief. As they delved deeper, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. As if urging them on, they discovered that many of the accidents at mile marker 13 were not mere coincidences. There were patterns, connections, and a chilling sense of deliberate malevolence. One name kept appearing in their research: Takashi Nakamura, a man who had died in a car crash near mile marker 13 several decades ago. His death had been ruled an accident, But there were whispers of foul play, of unresolved conflicts that had led to his untimely demise. Yuki and Hiroshi knew they had to find out more about Takashi and his life. They tracked down his surviving relatives, hoping to uncover the truth. Takashi's younger sister now, an elderly woman herself, welcomed them into her home. She spoke with a heavy heart, recounting the events that had led to her brother's death. Takashi was a kind man, she said, tears in her eyes. But he had enemies, people who were jealous of him, who wanted to see him fail. Yuki and Hiroshi listened intently, their hearts heavy with the weight of the tragedy. As they left her home, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had a name, a story, and a direction. The whispers seemed to guide them, urging them to uncover the truth and bring peace to the restless spirits. They returned to mile marker 13, determined to confront the past and lay the spirits to rest. As they stood at the fateful spot, the fog began to roll in once more, thick and oppressive. The whispering grew louder, surrounding them, filling the air with an eerie presence. Yuki and Hiroshi held hands, their resolve unshaken. "We're here to help you," Yuki called out, her voice strong and clear. "We know your story, and we're here to bring you peace." The whispering intensified, the voices overlapping, forming a cacophony of sorrow and desperation. Suddenly, the fog parted, revealing the shadowy figures they had seen before. They stood silently, their eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. Hiroshi stepped forward, his heart pounding. "We know what happened to you, Takashi. We know you were wronged. We're here to make it right." The figure of Takashi stepped forward, his expression one of profound sadness and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Yuki and Hiroshi felt a surge of relief, knowing they had finally made contact. As they watched, the figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the mist. The whispering grew fainter, replaced by a sense of peace and closure. Yuki and Hiroshi stood in silence, their hearts heavy with the weight of their journey. They knew there was still much to do, but they had taken the first step. They had faced the darkness, uncovered the truth, and brought light to the shadows. As they drove away from mile marker 13, the fog lifted completely, revealing a clear sky and the promise of a new day. Their journey was far from over, but they were no longer alone. They had each other, and they had the knowledge that they had made a difference. Together, they would continue to seek out the truth, to bring peace to the restless spirits, and to uncover the mysteries that lay hidden in the fog. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and the chirping of birds provided a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the previous night. Yuki and Hiroshi drove back to mile marker 13, their determination unwavering despite the fear that still lingered in their hearts. The librarian's words echoed in their minds, urging them to dig deeper, to uncover the truth and bring peace to the restless spirits. They arrived at the old man's house once more, hoping to gain further insights into the tragic events that had unfolded on this haunted stretch of road. The old man greeted them with a solemn nod, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resolve. "You're back," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Yuki nodded, her expression serious. "We learned about Takashi Nakamura. We believe his spirit is among those haunting mile marker 13. The old man sighed, leaning back in his chair. Takashi was a good man, but he had enemies. His death was a tragedy, one that left many questions unanswered. Hiroshi leaned forward, his eyes intense. "We need to know more about him, about what happened and why." The old man nodded slowly. Takashi was involved in a dispute with some powerful people. There were rumors of corruption, of hidden truths that someone wanted to keep buried. His death was officially ruled an accident, but many believed it was more than that. Yuki's eyes widened. "Do you have any proof? Anything that could help us uncover the truth?" The old man reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn envelope. "This was given to me by Takashi's sister. It's a letter he wrote shortly before his death. It might give you some clues. Yuki took the envelope with trembling hands, her heart pounding with anticipation. Thank you. We'll do our best to bring justice to Takashi and the others. As they left the old man's house, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. The letter in Yuki's hand was a tangible link to the past, a key that might unlock the secrets of mile marker 13. They returned to the cabin and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age and covered in neat, precise handwriting. Yuki began to read aloud, her voice steady but filled with emotion. To whoever finds this letter, my name is Takashi Nakamura. If you are reading this, it means I am no longer alive. I write this in the hope that my story will not be forgotten, and that justice will be served. I have uncovered evidence of corruption and deceit, perpetrated by those who hold power in this town. They have silenced those who dared to oppose them, and I fear I will be next. If anything happens to me, please find my sister. She knows the truth and can provide you with the evidence you need. Do not let my death be in vain. Yuki and Hiroshi exchanged a look, their resolve strengthened by Takashi's words. We need to find Takashi's sister, Hiroshi said, determination in his voice. She holds the key to all of this. They set out to locate her, their hearts heavy with the weight of their mission. It didn't take long to find her. She lived in a small, modest house on the outskirts of town, her eyes filled with sorrow and determination. She welcomed them inside, her frail hands trembling as she offered them tea. I knew someone would come eventually, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. Takashi was a brave man. He tried to stand up to the corruption, but they silenced him. Yuki and Hiroshi listened intently as she recounted the events that had led to her brother's death. She spoke of threats, of shadowy figures who had followed him, of the fear that had gripped their family. He left me a box, she said, her voice breaking. It contains all the evidence he gathered. I was too afraid to look at it, but I kept it safe, hoping that one day someone would find the courage to seek justice. She led them to a small room at the back of the house, where an old wooden box sat on a dusty shelf. Yuki and Hiroshi opened it carefully, revealing a treasure trove of documents, photographs, and tapes. They spent hours sifting through the contents, piecing together the puzzle of Takashi's investigation. The evidence was damning, implicating several prominent figures in a web of corruption and deceit. As they worked, the whispering began again, faint at first but growing louder, as if urging them on. They ignored it, their focus unwavering as they assembled the evidence. By the time they finished, the sun had set, and the cabin was bathed in the soft glow of the firelight. They had everything they needed to expose the truth, but their journey was far from over. We need to take this to the authorities, Hiroshi said, his voice filled with resolve. We can't let them get away with this. Yuki nodded, her eyes filled with determination. But we also need to be careful. These people are dangerous. They won't hesitate to silence us if they find out what we're doing. They decided to make copies of the evidence, ensuring that the truth would not be lost even if something happened to them. They worked late into the night, their fear giving way to a steely resolve. As they prepared to leave, Takashi's sister handed them a small, worn journal. This was Takashi's. He kept it with him at all times. It might give you more insight into what he was dealing with. Yuki took the journal with gratitude, feeling a deep connection to the man who had sacrificed so much for the truth. Thank you. We won't let his death be in vain. They left the house, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but they were determined to see it through. As they drove back to the cabin, the whispering began again, louder and more insistent. It filled the car, drowning out their thoughts. A cacophony of voices urging them on. Yuki gripped the journal tightly, her knuckles white. We have to keep going. We can't let them win. Hiroshi nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. We'll expose the truth, no matter what it takes. The next few days were a blur of activity. They met with journalists, handed over the evidence to trusted authorities, and ensured that Takashi's story would be told. The whispering followed them everywhere, a constant reminder of the spirits who depended on them, but it also gave them strength, a reminder of the importance of their mission. As the story broke, the town was rocked by scandal. The corruption that had festered for so long was finally exposed, and those responsible were brought to justice. Takashi's name was cleared, his bravery and determination celebrated by those who had once doubted him. The spirits of mile marker 13 were finally at peace, their voices fading into silence. Yuki and Hiroshi stood at the fateful spot, their hearts heavy with a mix of sorrow and relief. They had done what they set out to do, but the journey had changed them forever. "We did it," Yuki said, her voice filled with emotion. "We brought them peace." Hiroshi nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "And we honored Takashi's memory. He can finally rest." As they drove away from mile marker 13 for the last time, the fog lifted, revealing a clear sky and the promise of a new beginning. Their journey had been long and difficult, but they had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. Together, they would continue to seek out the truth, to bring light to the shadows, and to honor the memory of those who had been lost. They knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but they were no longer afraid. They had each other, and they had the knowledge that they had made a difference. As they drove into the distance, the whispering faded into silence, replaced by the peaceful hum of the engine and the promise of a brighter future. The sun had set, casting the forest in a twilight gloom that seemed to thicken the air. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches entwined like skeletal fingers reaching out to grasp the unwary. Yuki and Hiroshi parked the car near mile marker 13, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and determination. They had returned to this haunted place one last time, driven by the need to confront the malevolent force that had tormented them and the spirits trapped here. As they stepped out of the car, the familiar fog began to roll in, dense and suffocating. The whispering started almost immediately, a chorus of voices filled with anguish and despair. Yuki shivered, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "We have to do this," she whispered, more to herself than to Hiroshi. Hiroshi nodded, his expression grim. "We can't leave them like this. We have to put an end to it." They walked toward the spot where they had first encountered the spirits, the fog, growing thicker with each step. The air was cold, chilling them to the bone, and the whispering seemed to come from all directions, enveloping them in a cocoon of sound. Yuki clutched the journal Takashi had left behind, the words inside, a constant reminder of the pain and suffering these spirits had endured. As they reached the fateful spot, the fog parted slightly, revealing the shadowy figures of the restless spirits. Takashi stood at the forefront, his eyes filled with sorrow and desperation. "You came back," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. Yuki stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "We know what happened to you, Takashi. We know about the corruption, the deceit. We have exposed the truth." The other spirits seemed to react to her words, their forms becoming more distinct, their whispering growing louder. Hiroshi joined her, his voice steady. "We have brought justice to those responsible, but we need to know how to help you move on. What can we do?" Takashi's form flickered, as if struggling to maintain its cohesion. "There is one final thing. The place where I died, it holds the key. You must go there, confront the darkness that lingers, and lay us to rest." Yuki and Hiroshi exchanged a look, their determination unshaken. "We'll do it," Yuki said, her voice filled with resolve. "We'll finish this." The fog thickened around them, the whispering growing almost deafening. The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the mist. "Follow the road," Takashi's voice echoed. "Find the place where the truth lies hidden." With those words, the spirits vanished, leaving Yuki and Hiroshi alone in the thickening fog. They returned to the car, their hearts heavy with the weight of their mission. They knew the road ahead would be perilous, but they were determined to see it through. They drove slowly, the fog reducing their visibility to mere feet. The whispering followed them, a constant reminder of the spirits who depended on them. After what felt like hours, they reached a bend in the road, a place where the trees seemed to close in, casting long shadows in the foggy night. Yuki's heart pounded as she recognized the spot. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where Takashi died." They got out of the car, the cold air biting into their skin. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if urging them forward. They walked toward the edge of the road, where a steep drop-off led down to a rocky ravine. The fog was so thick that they could barely see the bottom. "We need to go down there," Hiroshi said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Yuki nodded, her hands trembling. "Let's go." They carefully made their way down the rocky slope, the fog swirling around them like a living entity. The whispering seemed to grow louder, with each step filling their ears with a cacophony of voices. At the bottom of the ravine, they found the wreckage of an old car, its metal twisted and rusted with age. This was where Takashi had met his end, a tragic accident that had claimed his life. Yuki felt a chill run down her spine as she approached the wreckage. "This is where it happened," she said, her voice trembling. Hiroshi nodded, his eyes scanning the area. "We need to find whatever is keeping the spirits here, something that ties them to this place." They searched the wreckage, their hands trembling as they sifted through the debris. The whispering grew louder, almost frantic, as if urging them to find the truth. Yuki's heart skipped a beat as she found an old, leather-bound book hidden under the seat. She opened it, her breath catching as she recognized Takashi's handwriting. "It's his diary," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "He must have left it here." Hiroshi looked over her shoulder, his eyes widening as he read the words. "This is it. This is what we need to lay him to rest." Yuki began to read aloud, her voice steady. Despite the fear that gripped her heart, the diary detailed Takashi's investigation, his discovery of the corruption, and the threats he had received. As she read, the whispering grew louder, the spirits' forms beginning to take shape in the fog. They surrounded Yuki and Hiroshi, their eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope. "We know the truth," Yuki said, her voice strong and clear. "We have exposed the corruption, but we need to know how to help you move on." Takashi's form flickered, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You must burn the diary. Release the secrets that have bound us to this place." Yuki nodded, her resolve unshaken. She took a deep breath and held the diary over the wreckage, her hands trembling. She lit a match and set the diary ablaze, the flames quickly consuming the pages. As the diary burned, the whispering grew louder, reaching a crescendo before abruptly stopping. The spirits' forms began to dissolve, their faces filled with peace and gratitude. "Thank you," Takashi whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "You have set us free." With those words, the spirits vanished, leaving Yuki and Hiroshi alone in the ravine. The fog began to lift, revealing the clear night sky above. They stood in silence, their hearts heavy with the weight of their journey. They had faced the darkness, uncovered the truth, and brought peace to the restless spirits. "We did it," Yuki said, her voice filled with emotion. "We brought them peace." Hiroshi nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "And we honored Takashi's memory. He can finally rest." As they made their way back up the slope, the first rays of dawn began to break through the trees, casting a golden glow on the forest. Their journey had been long and difficult, but they had emerged stronger. Together, they had faced the darkness and brought light to the shadows. As they drove away from mile marker 13 for the last time, the fog lifted completely, revealing a clear sky and the promise of a new beginning. Their journey was far from over, but they were no longer alone. They had each other, and they had the knowledge that they had made a difference. Together, they would continue to seek out the truth, to bring peace to the restless spirits, and to uncover the mysteries that lay hidden in the fog. They knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but they were ready to face them, united in their purpose and strengthened by their experiences. As they drove into the distance, the whispering faded into silence, replaced by the peaceful hum of the engine and the promise of a brighter future. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, bringing peace to the restless spirits and honoring the memory of those who had been lost. Together, they would continue their journey, guided by the light of truth and the strength of their bond. The sun had just set, casting a warm orange hue across the tranquil Japanese countryside. The narrow road winding through the dense forest was enveloped in the soft, lingering light of dusk. Tall, ancient trees lined either side of the road, their gnarled branches forming a natural tunnel that seemed to close in as darkness approached. The chirping of cicadas filled the air, a familiar sound that slowly gave way to the whispers of the night. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, the forest was plunged into an eerie silence. The only light now came from the occasional flickering of fireflies and the dim glow of the car's headlights cutting through the thickening darkness. Hiroshi Nakamura, a middle-aged man with a weary face, gripped the steering wheel tightly. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his eyes flickering with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Beside him sat his younger brother Kenji, whose eyes were fixed on the road ahead, oblivious to the unease that seemed to grip Hiroshi. They were on their way to their family's old summer home, a place they hadn't visited in years. The house, nestled deep within the forest, held many childhood memories, but tonight it felt like a journey into the unknown. The car's engine hummed softly as they drove deeper into the forest. The road ahead was dark and winding, and Hiroshi couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced again at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows behind them. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out behind them. "Are you all right, Hiroshi?" Kenji asked, noticing his brother's distracted demeanor. "Yeah, I'm fine," Hiroshi replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." Kenji nodded and turned his attention back to the road. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and memories of the past. As they approached a sharp bend in the road, the headlights briefly illuminated an old signpost. It was rusted and barely legible, but Hiroshi recognized it immediately. They were close to the house. The car rounded the bend, and there it was, the old summer home, standing silent and forlorn in the middle of a small clearing. The once vibrant garden was now overgrown with weeds, and the paint on the house was peeling and faded. Hiroshi parked the car and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was almost deafening, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "This place hasn't changed much," Kenji said, breaking the silence. "Yeah," Hiroshi agreed, though he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. There was something about the house that felt different, almost oppressive. They got out of the car and began unloading their bags. As Hiroshi carried his bag towards the front door, he felt a sudden chill run down his spine. He turned around, his eyes scanning the dark forest. Again, there was nothing, just the quiet, still night. They entered the house, and a musty smell greeted them. The interior was dimly lit, the furniture covered in white sheets. Hiroshi switched on a light, and the room was bathed in a soft, yellow glow. The house felt eerily quiet, as if it had been waiting for them. Kenji walked over to the fireplace and began to clear away the dust and cobwebs. Hiroshi wandered through the house, memories flooding back with every step. He found himself in the living room, staring at an old family photo on the wall. It was a picture of their parents, taken many years ago. Hiroshi felt a pang of sadness. Their parents had passed away in a car accident when they were still young. "Hiroshi, can you help me with this?" Kenji's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned and saw Kenji struggling with a heavy wooden chest. Together, they managed to move it and set it down in the corner of the room. "Thanks," Kenji said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "No problem," Hiroshi replied, but his mind was still elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They spent the next hour cleaning and organizing the house. As night fell, they decided to call it a day and get some rest. Hiroshi lay in his old bed, staring up at the ceiling. The events of the day played over and over in his mind. Just as he was about to drift off to sleep, he heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. He sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, but he could just make out the shape of the door. The whisper came again, this time clearer. It sounded like a woman's voice calling his name. Hiroshi. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Slowly, he got out of bed and walked towards the door. The whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The house was dark and silent, but he could feel a presence, something watching him. He walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing softly. As he reached the living room, he saw a shadowy figure standing by the fireplace. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure turned slowly, and Hiroshi felt a chill run down his spine. It was a woman, her face pale and ghostly, her eyes hollow and empty. She raised a hand and pointed towards the door. Hiroshi felt a sudden urge to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. "Leave," she whispered, her voice echoing through the room. "Leave this place." Hiroshi stumbled backwards, his heart racing. He turned and ran back to his room, slamming the door shut behind him. He leaned against the door, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. What had he just seen? Was it a ghost, or was his mind playing tricks on him? He didn't sleep that night, his mind too filled with fear and confusion. When morning came, he told Kenji about what he had seen. But Kenji dismissed it as a bad dream. "You were just tired, Hiroshi," he said. "This house can be a bit creepy at night, but there's nothing to be afraid of." Hiroshi wanted to believe him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the day wore on, the events of the night before seemed to fade, replaced by the tasks at hand, but the memory of the ghostly figure stayed with him, a dark shadow lurking at the edge of his thoughts. That evening, they decided to take a drive into town to get some supplies. As they drove down the narrow, winding road, Hiroshi felt a sense of relief. The forest didn't seem as menacing in the daylight, and the drive gave him a chance to clear his mind. But as they neared the bend in the road where they had seen the old signposts, Hiroshi felt a sudden chill. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, a shadowy figure standing by the side of the road, watching them. He slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop. "What's wrong?" Kenji asked, startled. "Did you see that?" Hiroshi asked, his voice trembling. There was someone standing by the road. Kenji looked back, but there was nothing there. "Hiroshi, there's no one there," he said. "You're just tired." Hiroshi shook his head, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He started the car again and drove on, his eyes blinking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. When they returned to the house, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. Hiroshi felt a sense of dread as they approached the house, but he tried to push it aside. They unloaded the car and went inside, the familiar musty smell greeting them. As night fell, the house seemed to come alive with shadows. Hiroshi couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. He kept hearing whispers, faint and distant, but always there, just at the edge of his hearing. He sat in the living room, staring at the old family photo. The memories of his parents flooded back, bringing with them a wave of sadness. He missed them terribly, and he couldn't help but wonder if their spirits were still here, watching over the house. As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder. Hiroshi felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that they were not alone. The ghostly figure he had seen the night before was back, standing in the corner of the room, watching him. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed towards the door. "Leave," it whispered. "Leave this place." Hiroshi felt a wave of fear wash over him. He turned and ran out of the room, his mind racing. He had to get out of the house, away from the ghostly presence that seemed to haunt every corner. He found Kenji in the kitchen, preparing a late-night snack. "We have to leave," Hiroshi said, his voice shaking. "There's something in this house, something evil." Kenji looked at him, concern etched on his face. "Hiroshi, calm down," he said. "There's nothing here. You're just tired." Hiroshi shook his head. "No, I saw it. There's a ghost, a woman. She wants us to leave." Kenji sighed. "Hiroshi, you need to rest. You're not thinking clearly." But Hiroshi couldn't shake the feeling that they were in danger. He knew they had to leave, but he couldn't convince Kenji. He felt a sense of helplessness wash over him as he realized that they were trapped in the house, surrounded by shadows and whispers. That night, Hiroshi didn't sleep. He sat in his room, listening to the whispers that seemed to come from every corner. He could feel the presence of the ghostly woman, watching him, waiting. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, Hiroshi made a decision. They had to leave, no matter what. He got up and went to find Kenji, determined to convince him to leave the house. But as he reached Kenji's room, he saw the ghostly figure standing at the foot of Kenji's bed. Hiroshi felt a wave of fear wash over him as he realized that the ghost was real, and it was not going to let them leave. The ghost turned to him, its hollow eyes staring into his soul. "Leave," it whispered, its voice echoing through the room. "Leave this place." Hiroshi backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get Kenji out of the house, away from the ghostly presence that seemed to haunt every corner. He ran to Kenji's side and shook him awake. "Kenji, wake up. We have to go," he said, his voice filled with urgency. Kenji groaned and rubbed his eyes. "What's going on?" he asked, still half asleep. "The ghost, it's here. We have to leave now," Hiroshi said, pulling Kenji out of bed. They grabbed their bags and ran out of the house, not looking back. As they drove away, Hiroshi glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The ghostly figure was standing in the doorway, watching them go. Hiroshi felt a sense of relief as they left the house behind. But he knew that the experience would stay with him forever. He had seen the ghostly presence that haunted the house, and he knew that it would always be a part of his memories. As they drove away, the forest seemed to close in behind them, the shadows growing longer and darker. Hiroshi couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even as they left the house far behind. The road ahead was long and winding, and Hiroshi knew that they had a long journey ahead of them. But he was determined to leave the ghostly presence behind, to find a new beginning away from the shadows and whispers that had haunted them. The sun was rising, casting a warm, golden light across the countryside. Hiroshi felt a sense of hope as they drove towards the horizon, leaving the past behind and looking forward to a brighter future. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw a shadowy figure standing by the side of the road, watching them. Hiroshi's heart skipped a beat as he realized that the ghostly presence was still with them, following them into the future. The whispers were still there, faint and distant, but always there, just at the edge of his hearing. Hiroshi knew that he would never escape the ghostly presence that haunted him, but he was determined to keep moving forward, to find a new beginning away from the shadows and whispers of the past. As they drove into the distance, the sun rose higher, casting a warm, golden light across the landscape. Hiroshi felt a sense of peace as they left the past behind, but he knew that the ghostly presence would always be a part of his memories, a shadow that would follow him wherever he went. But for now, he was content to drive towards the horizon, looking forward to a new beginning and leaving the shadows of the past behind. The morning sun filtered through the trees as Hiroshi and Kenji continued their drive away from the old summer home. The tension from the previous night still lingered, casting a shadow over the bright day. Kenji tried to lighten the mood, making small talk and pointing out familiar landmarks from their childhood, but Hiroshi remained distant. His mind was replaying the events of the night, the ghostly figure's warning echoing in his thoughts. As they drove further, the landscape gradually changed. The dense forest gave way to rolling hills and open fields, the air growing warmer and the sky clearer. Despite the change in scenery, Hiroshi couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every glance in the rearview mirror sent a shiver down his spine, the memory of the ghost's hollow eyes still fresh. Maybe we should take a break, Kenji suggested, noticing Hiroshi's distraction. There's a small town up ahead. We can stop for lunch and get some rest. Hiroshi nodded, grateful for the suggestion. They pulled into a quaint town, its streets lined with traditional wooden houses and small shops. The town had a nostalgic charm, reminding Hiroshi of simpler times. They found a small restaurant and settled into a corner booth. As they waited for their food, Hiroshi finally spoke. Kenji, I can't stop thinking about last night. What if there really is something in that house? Kenji sighed, leaning back in his seat. Hiroshi, I know it was scary, but we have to be rational. Maybe it was just our minds playing tricks on us. Hiroshi shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. No, it was real. I saw her. She was trying to warn us. Kenji looked at his brother, concern in his eyes. All right, let's say she was real. What do? We can't just ignore it. Hiroshi appreciated Kenji's willingness to listen. We need to understand why she's there. Maybe there's something we can do to help her, to put her spirit to rest. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their food. As they ate, they discussed their plan. They decided to visit the local library, hoping to find any records or stories about the house and its history. The library was a short walk from the restaurant, its exterior, a mix of old and new architecture. Inside, the air was cool and quiet, the smell of aged paper filling the space. They approached the librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. Excuse me, we're looking for information about an old house in the forest. It's been in our family for generations. The librarian nodded, her eyes lighting up with interest. I know the place you're talking about. It has quite a history. Follow me. She led them to a section of the library filled with old records and documents. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound book and handed it to them. This is a collection of local folklore and history. You might find something useful in here. Hiroshi and Kenji thanked her and found a quiet corner to sit and read. The book was filled with stories of the town and its surroundings, some dating back centuries. As they flipped through the pages, a particular story caught Hiroshi's eye. It was about a woman named Yuki, who had lived in the forest many years ago. According to the story, Yuki was known for her beauty and kindness, but her life was marked by tragedy. Her husband had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and she was left alone, haunted by his loss. Villagers reported seeing her wandering the forest, searching for her husband and warning travelers to stay away. Hiroshi felt a chill as he read the story. Could Yuki be the ghost they had seen? He shared the story with Kenji, who looked equally unsettled. If this is her, then maybe she's still looking for her husband. Maybe that's why she's there. Kenji nodded, deep in thought. But why warn us to leave? What danger could there be? Hiroshi had no answers, but he felt a growing determination to find out. They thanked the librarian and left the library, their minds buzzing with questions. As they walked back to their car, Hiroshi noticed an old man sitting on a bench, watching them intently. The man's eyes were sharp and curious, as if he knew something they didn't. Hiroshi hesitated, then approached him. Excuse me, sir. Do you know anything about the old house in the forest? The man's gaze didn't waver. I know many things about that house. It's a place of sorrow and secrets. Why do you ask? Hiroshi explained their situation, the ghostly encounter, and the story of Yuki they had read. The old man listened carefully, then nodded slowly. Yuki's story is well known around here. She was a good woman, but her life was filled with pain. Her husband's disappearance drove her mad with grief. He paused, his expression growing serious. Some say the forest is cursed. that those who die there are trapped, unable to move on. Yuki's spirit may be one of many, bound to that place by her sorrow. Hiroshi felt a cold weight settle in his chest. What can we do? How can we help her? The old man shook his head. Helping spirits is a delicate matter. Sometimes they need to be reminded of their humanity, their connection to the world of the living. But it's dangerous. Spirits can be unpredictable, especially those consumed by grief. Hiroshi thanked the man and returned to Kenji, who was waiting by the car. What did he say? Kenji asked. Hiroshi relayed the conversation, and they both felt the gravity of their situation. They decided to return to the house, determined to confront Yuki's spirit and find a way to help her move on. As they drove back, the forest loomed ahead, its shadows growing longer in the fading light. The sense of foreboding returned, but this time Hiroshi felt a resolve to face whatever lay ahead. They arrived at the house as night fell, the moon casting a pale light over the clearing. Hiroshi and Kenji entered the house, the air thick with tension. The whispers started almost immediately, soft and insistent, echoing through the rooms. Hiroshi called out, his voice steady. Yuki, we know your story. We want to help you. The whispers grew louder, and a chill filled the air. The ghostly figure appeared again, standing by the fireplace. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, her voice a mournful whisper. Leave this place. Hiroshi stepped forward, his heart pounding. Yuki, we know you're searching for your husband. We want to help you find peace. The ghost's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed to waver. Hiroshi continued, his voice gentle. You don't have to be alone anymore. We can help you remember your life, your humanity. Kenji joined him, his voice calm and reassuring. We're here to help. Please, let us help you. The ghostly figure seemed to soften, her form becoming less defined. The whispers quieted, and for a moment there was a peaceful silence. Then, a soft breeze stirred the air, and the ghost's form dissipated, leaving the room empty. Hiroshi and Kenji stood in the silence, their hearts racing. Had they succeeded? Had Yuki found some measure of peace? As they prepared to leave, Hiroshi felt a sense of closure, a weight lifting from his shoulders. But as they stepped outside, the old man from the town appeared at the edge of the clearing. He watched them with a knowing look, his presence both comforting and unsettling. You did well, he said, his voice carrying on the wind. But remember, the forest holds many secrets. Be careful. Hiroshi nodded, understanding the warning. They got into the car and drove away, the house disappearing behind them. The drive back was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. The sun began to rise, casting a golden light over the landscape. Hiroshi glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see the ghostly figure watching them. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out behind them. As they drove into the new day, Hiroshi felt a sense of hope. They had faced the darkness and come through it stronger and more united. But the forest and its secrets would always be a part of them, a reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. And the whispers, faint and distant, would stay with him, a haunting echo of the past. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale, ghostly light over the forest as Hiroshi and Kenji made their way back to the old summer home. The night was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The air was thick with tension, and Hiroshi couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. The headlights of their car pierced through the darkness, illuminating the narrow, winding road that led back to the house. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. Hiroshi's grip on the steering wheel tightened as they neared the house, his heart pounding in his chest. Kenji sat beside him, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But Hiroshi could see the worry etched on his face. They had faced the ghost of Yuki and had tried to help her find peace. But Hiroshi couldn't shake the feeling that their task was far from over. As they approached the clearing, where the house stood, Hiroshi felt a chill run down his spine. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and empty, like eyes watching them approach. He parked the car and turned off the engine. The sudden silence, almost deafening. For a moment, neither of them moved, both lost in their thoughts. "We're back," Kenji said, breaking the silence. Hiroshi nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The whispers from the night before echoed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They got out of the car and walked towards the house. The front door creaked open, and they stepped inside. The air, thick with the musty smell of old wood and dust. The house was silent, but Hiroshi could feel a presence, something watching them from the shadows. They made their way to the living room, where they had last seen the ghostly figure of Yuki. The room was empty, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. Hiroshi called out, his voice steady. "Yuki, we're here to help you. Please, show yourself." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the whispers started again, soft and insistent, echoing through the room. The ghostly figure of Yuki appeared by the fireplace, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Leave," she whispered, her voice echoing through the room. "Leave this place." Hiroshi stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Yuki, we want to help you. Please, let us help you find peace." The ghost's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed to waver. Kenji joined him, his voice calm and reassuring. "We're here to help. Please, let us help you." The ghostly figure seemed to soften, her form becoming less defined. The whispers quieted, and for a moment there was a peaceful silence. Then, a sudden, cold breeze swept through the room, and the ghost's form solidified. Her eyes were filled with anger and fear, and her voice was a desperate cry. "Leave, you must leave, the darkness is coming." Hiroshi felt a chill run down his spine. "What darkness? What are you talking about?" The ghost form flickered, and she pointed towards the window. "Look, see for yourselves." Hiroshi and Kenji turned and looked out the window. In the distance, they could see a dark shape moving through the forest, its form indistinct and menacing. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, filling the room with a sense of dread. Hiroshi turned back to the ghost, his voice urgent. "Yuki, what is that? What is coming?" The ghost's eyes filled with tears, and her voice was a mournful whisper. "The darkness, it is a curse that binds us to this place. You must leave before it takes you too." Hiroshi felt a wave of fear wash over him. "What can we do? How can we stop it?" The ghost form flickered again, and she seemed to struggle to find the words. "You must find the source of the curse. It lies beneath the house." Hiroshi felt a sense of urgency. "We'll do it. We'll find the source and put an end to this." The ghost form began to fade, her voice growing fainter. "Hurry, there is not much time." As the ghost disappeared, Hiroshi and Kenji exchanged a look of determination. They knew what they had to do. They made their way to the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was dark and damp, the walls covered in moss and cobwebs. Hiroshi felt a sense of foreboding as they descended the stairs, the whispers growing louder. They reached the bottom of the stairs and found themselves in a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was an old wooden chest, its surface covered in strange symbols. Hiroshi approached the chest, his heart pounding. He could feel a dark energy emanating from it, a sense of malevolence that sent chills down his spine. He reached out and touched the chest, and a jolt of cold energy shot through him. He pulled back, his hand trembling. "This is it," he said, his voice trembling. "This is the source of the curse." Kenji nodded, his face pale. "What do we do now?" Hiroshi took a deep breath, steeling himself. "We have to open it. We have to find out what's inside." He reached out again, his hand steady this time, and lifted the lid of the chest. Inside, they found an old, leather-bound book, its pages filled with strange symbols and drawings. Hiroshi picked up the book, and a wave of dark energy washed over him. He could feel the malevolence emanating from the pages. a sense of dread that made his skin crawl. "We have to destroy this," he said, his voice steady. "It's the only way to break the curse." Kenji nodded, his face set with determination. "Let's do it." They took the book upstairs and placed it in the fireplace. Hiroshi struck a match and set the book on fire. The flames consumed the pages, and a dark smoke filled the room. The whispers grew louder, and the house seemed to tremble. Then, as the last page turned to ash, the whispers stopped, and the air grew still. The sense of malevolence lifted, and Hiroshi felt a sense of relief wash over him. They had done it. They had broken the curse. The ghostly figure of Yuki appeared one last time, her form peaceful and serene. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for freeing me." Hiroshi felt a sense of peace as he watched the ghost fade away. Her spirit finally at rest, he turned to Kenji, a smile on his face. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with relief. "We finally did it." Kenji nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, we did." As they left the house, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The forest seemed brighter, the shadows less menacing. Hiroshi felt a sense of hope as they walked towards the car. They had faced the darkness and come through it stronger and more united. As they drove away, Hiroshi glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The house stood silent and empty, its windows reflecting the light of the rising sun. He knew that the forest and its secrets would always be a part of them. But he also knew that they had the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The road ahead was long and winding, but Hiroshi felt a sense of peace as they drove towards the horizon. The past was behind them, and the future stretched out ahead, filled with endless possibilities. As they drove into the new day, Hiroshi felt a sense of hope and determination. They had faced the darkness and come through it, and he knew that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The whispers were gone, replaced by the sounds of the morning birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Hiroshi felt a sense of closure as they left the forest behind, the dark memories fading with each passing mile. They had faced their fears and found the strength to overcome them. And Hiroshi knew that they would carry that strength with them into the future. As they drove towards the horizon, the sun rising higher in the sky, Hiroshi felt a sense of peace and contentment. They had faced the darkness and come through it, and he knew that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The road was long and winding, but Hiroshi felt a sense of hope as they drove towards the horizon. The future bright and filled with endless possibilities. They had faced their fears and found the strength to overcome them. And Hiroshi knew that they would carry that strength with them into the future. No matter what challenges lay ahead, the moon had risen high in the sky, casting its cold, pale light over the forest. Hiroshi and Kenji stood in front of the old summer home, the shadows of the trees stretching long and dark around them. The air was thick with a sense of finality. The whispers that had haunted them for so long now silent. They had broken the curse, or so they believed. But the feeling of unease remained, a persistent chill that refused to leave Hiroshi's bones. "We need to be sure," Hiroshi said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Kenji nodded, understanding the unspoken fear that lingered between them. They entered the house one last time, the wooden floorboards creaking under their feet. The air inside was colder than outside, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Hiroshi felt a familiar shiver run down his spine as they made their way to the living room. The fireplace, now cold and dark, stood as a silent witness to their ordeal. Hiroshi's eyes were drawn to the spot where Yuki's ghost had appeared. It was empty now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. "Let's check the basement again," Hiroshi suggested, his voice echoing in the silent room. Kenji agreed, and they made their way down the narrow staircase. The basement was just as they had left it. The chest now nothing more than a pile of ash, but the oppressive feeling of darkness was gone, replaced by a strange sense of calm. Hiroshi felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they really had done it. As they turned to leave, a soft sound caught Hiroshi's attention. It was a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, coming from the corner of the room. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Kenji, did you hear that?" Kenji nodded, his face pale. They moved towards the corner, the whispers growing louder with each step. It was the same voice they had heard before, but now it was filled with a sense of urgency. "Help, help me!" Hiroshi's blood ran cold. The voice was not Yuki's. It was deeper, more desperate. They reached the corner and found an old wooden door, half hidden by the shadows. It was a door they had never noticed before, its surface covered in strange symbols. Hiroshi felt a sense of dread as he reached for the handle. "Are you sure about this?" Kenji asked, his voice trembling. Hiroshi nodded, his hand steady. "We have to know." He turned the handle and pushed the door open. A rush of cold air hit them, and they stepped into a dark, narrow passage. The walls were damp and covered in moss, the air thick with the smell of decay. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls. Hiroshi led the way, his heart pounding in his chest. The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the darkness. Finally, they reached the end. The passage opened into a small, circular room, its walls covered in strange symbols and drawings. In the center of the room was a stone altar, and lying on the altar was a book. It was the same book they had burned in the fireplace, now whole and untouched. Hiroshi felt a wave of fear wash over him. "This isn't possible," he whispered. Kenji stepped forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. "We destroyed it. How can it be here?" Hiroshi shook his head, unable to answer. He reached out and touched the book, and a jolt of cold energy shot through him. He pulled back, his hand trembling. "We have to destroy it again," he said, his voice filled with determination. Kenji nodded, and together they lifted the book from the altar. As they did, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with a sense of urgency. They carried the book back through the passage, the whispers following them. When they reached the basement, they placed the book in the center of the room. Hiroshi struck a match and set the book on fire. The flames consumed the pages, and a dark smoke filled the room. The whispers grew louder, and the house seemed to tremble. Then, as the last page turned to ash, the whispers stopped, and the air grew still. The sense of malevolence lifted, and Hiroshi felt a sense of relief wash over him. They had done it. They had broken the curse. The ghostly figure of Yuki appeared one last time, her form peaceful and serene. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for freeing me." Hiroshi felt a sense of peace as he watched the ghost fade away. Her spirit finally at rest, he turned to Kenji, a smile on his face. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with relief. "We finally did it." Kenji nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, we did." As they left the house, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The forest seemed brighter, the shadows less menacing. Hiroshi felt a sense of hope as they walked towards the car. They had faced the darkness and come through it stronger and more united. As they drove away, Hiroshi glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The house stood silent and empty, its windows reflecting the light of the rising sun. He knew that the forest and its secrets would always be a part of them. But he also knew that they had the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The road ahead was long and winding, but Hiroshi felt a sense of peace as they drove towards the horizon. The past was behind them, and the future stretched out ahead, filled with endless possibilities. As they drove into the new day, Hiroshi felt a sense of hope and determination. They had faced the darkness and come through it, and he knew that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The whispers were gone, replaced by the sounds of the morning birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Hiroshi felt a sense of closure as they left the forest behind, the dark memories fading with each passing mile. They had faced their fears and found the strength to overcome them. And Hiroshi knew that they would carry that strength with them into the future. As they drove towards the horizon, the sun rising higher in the sky, Hiroshi felt a sense of peace and contentment. They had faced the darkness and come through it, and he knew that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The road was long and winding, but Hiroshi felt a sense of hope as they drove towards the horizon. The future bright and filled with endless possibilities. They had faced their fears and found the strength to overcome them. And Hiroshi knew that they would carry that strength with them into the future, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, casting an eerie orange glow over the dense forest that lined the narrow, winding road. A soft mist began to rise from the ground, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that seemed to blur the line between reality and the supernatural. The chirping of cicadas filled the air, gradually giving way to the haunting calls of night creatures as darkness slowly enveloped the landscape. The car, an old and somewhat battered Toyota, moved cautiously along the road, its headlights cutting through the growing gloom. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere was a mix of excitement and apprehension. Haruka, a young woman in her late 20s, sat in the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the road ahead with a mix of curiosity and unease. Her boyfriend, Kenji, was behind the wheel, his hands gripping the steering wheel a bit too tightly. In the back seat, Haruka's younger brother, Yuta, and his friend Mika were chatting animatedly, their voices a welcome distraction from the creeping sense of foreboding. "We're almost there," Kenji announced, glancing at the GPS mounted on the dashboard. "Just a few more kilometers and we'll reach the campsite." Haruka nodded, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in her stomach. She had heard stories about this road, tales of strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances, but she had dismissed them as mere urban legends. Now, as the shadows deepened and the road seemed to narrow, she couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to those stories. "Hey, did you guys know that this road is supposed to be haunted?" Yuta's voice broke through her thoughts, his tone filled with excitement. Mika laughed, though there was a nervous edge to it. "Come on, Yuta, don't start with those ghost stories. You're going to scare Haruka." Haruka forced a smile, turning in her seat to look at her brother. "It's fine, Mika. I'm not that easily scared." But as she spoke, she couldn't help but glance out the window at the darkening forest, her imagination conjuring up images of ghostly figures lurking among the trees. Kenji chuckled, though his eyes remained focused on the road. "Let's not get too carried away with ghost stories. We've got a long night ahead of us." The road continued to wind through the forest, the trees closing in on either side like silent sentinels. The mist grew thicker, swirling around the car in ghostly tendrils that seemed to reach out towards them. The conversation in the car died down, replaced by an uneasy silence that seemed to mirror the growing tension outside. As they rounded a particularly sharp bend, the car's headlights suddenly illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. Kenji slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest as the car came to a sudden stop. The figure, a woman dressed in a tattered white kimono, stood motionless, her long, black hair hanging down over her face. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The only sound the pounding of their hearts and the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind. Is she real?" Mika whispered, her voice trembling. Haruka felt a chill run down her spine as she stared at the figure. There was something deeply unsettling about her, something that set off alarm bells in her mind. Kenji slowly unbuckled his seatbelt, his eyes never leaving the woman. "I'll go check on her. Maybe she needs help." Haruka reached out, grabbing his arm. "No, Kenji. There's something wrong about this. Let's just go." But Kenji shook his head, gently prying her fingers away. "We can't just leave her here. What if she's hurt?" He opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air, the mist swirling around his legs as he approached the woman. Haruka watched, her heart pounding in her chest, as Kenji slowly made his way towards the figure. The woman didn't move, didn't make a sound, as if she were a statue, carved out of the night itself. As Kenji got closer, he reached out a hand, his voice gentle. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" For a moment, there was no response. Then, with a sudden, almost unnatural speed, the woman's head snapped up, revealing a face twisted in a grotesque, inhuman snarl. Her eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and a guttural, otherworldly scream tore from her lips. Kenji stumbled back, his face a mask of terror. But before he could react, the woman lunged at him, her hands clawing at his throat. Haruka screamed, the sound echoing through the forest as she watched in horror. Kenji tried to fight back, but the woman's strength was far beyond that of any human. In a matter of moments, he was on the ground, his body convulsing as the woman's hands tightened around his neck. Without thinking, Haruka threw open her door and ran towards them, her mind a blur of fear and desperation. But as she reached out to pull the woman away, a cold, invisible force knocked her back, sending her sprawling to the ground. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the woman's glowing eyes, filled with a hatred that seemed to burn through the very fabric of reality. When Haruka regained consciousness, she found herself lying on the cold, hard ground, the taste of blood in her mouth. The car was gone, as was Kenji, and the forest was eerily silent. The only sound, the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. She struggled to her feet, her body aching, and looked around in confusion. There was no sign of the woman, no sign of the struggle that had just taken place. It was as if everything had been swallowed up by the night, leaving no trace behind. "Yuta! Mika!" she called out, her voice hoarse. But there was no response, only the oppressive silence of the forest. Panic began to set in as she stumbled through the trees, her mind racing. What had happened to Kenji? Where were Yuta and Mika? And what was that thing that had attacked them? As she wandered through the forest, her thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent her heart racing, her eyes darting around in search of some unseen threat. Hours seemed to pass as she wandered aimlessly, the forest around her, becoming an endless maze of shadows and whispers. Just when she was about to give up hope, she stumbled upon a small, dilapidated shrine hidden among the trees. Its ancient wooden structure was covered in moss and vines, and the air around it felt heavy with an almost palpable sense of dread. Desperate for some semblance of safety, Haruka approached the shrine, her steps hesitant. As she neared the entrance, she noticed a small, weathered sign written in kanji, "Beware the curse of the forest." A shiver ran down her spine as she read the words, her mind racing with thoughts of the stories she had heard. Could this be the source of the curse that haunted the road? With a deep breath, she stepped inside the shrine, cold and musty. The interior was small and dimly lit, the only light coming from a few flickering candles placed around a worn altar. On the altar lay a series of ancient scrolls, their edges frayed and yellowed with age. Curiosity getting the better of her, Haruka carefully unrolled one of the scrolls, her eyes scanning the faded ink. The writing was old and difficult to decipher, but as she read, a chilling story began to unfold. It spoke of a vengeful spirit, a woman who had been wronged and had taken her own life in the forest centuries ago. Her spirit, consumed by hatred and sorrow, had cursed the land, dooming all who traveled the road to a fate worse than death. Haruka's heart sank as she realized the truth. The woman they had encountered was the vengeful spirit, and they had unwittingly become entangled in her curse. She had to find a way to break the curse to save Kenji and the others. But how? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, chilling breeze that swept through the shrine, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. Haruka's breath caught in her throat as she felt a cold, ghostly presence closing in around her. She turned to run, but her legs refused to move, frozen in place by an unseen force. A soft, whispering voice filled her ears, its words like ice on her skin. "You cannot escape, you are mine." The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her. was the glowing eyes of the vengeful spirit burning with an unholy light. Haruka awoke to the sound of rustling leaves and the distant calls of night creatures. The forest around her was bathed in an eerie twilight, the moonlight filtering through the dense canopy above. She felt a cold dampness seeping through her clothes and realized she was lying on the forest floor. A shiver ran down her spine as she remembered the events that had led her here. Kenji's terrifying encounter with the ghostly woman, the cold force that had knocked her unconscious, and the ancient shrine with its haunting message. She struggled to her feet, her body itching from the fall. As she looked around, the oppressive silence of the forest seemed to close in on her. There was no sign of the car, no sign of Kenji, Yuta, or Mika. Panic began to set in as she called out their names, her voice echoing through the trees. Kenji, Yuta, Mika. But there was no response, only the rustling of leaves in the wind. Haruka knew she couldn't stay here. She had to find her friends and figure out how to break the curse that had ensnared them. With a deep breath, she started walking, her eyes scanning the forest for any sign of a path or a clue. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees towering above her like silent sentinels. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that unseen eyes were following her every move. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to stay calm, her mind racing with thoughts of the vengeful spirit and the curse that haunted the road. After what felt like hours of walking, she stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center stood an old, weathered torii gate, its wooden structure covered in moss and vines. The sight of it sent a shiver down her spine, but she knew she had to investigate. As she approached the gate, she noticed a narrow path leading deeper into the forest. With a sense of foreboding, she stepped through the gate and onto the path, the air around her growing colder with each step. The path was narrow and winding, the trees closing in on either side, like walls of a labyrinth. Haruka felt a growing sense of unease as she walked, the shadows around her seeming to twist and shift in the corner of her vision. She tried to stay focused, her mind racing with thoughts of her friends and the curse that bound them. Just as she was about to turn back, she heard a faint sound in the distance. It was a soft, melodic humming, like a lullaby carried on the wind. Haruka's heart skipped a beat as she followed the sound, her steps quickening. The path opened up into another clearing, and there, standing in the moonlight, was a figure. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white kimono, her long black hair cascading down her back. She was the same woman they had encountered on the road, the vengeful spirit that had attacked Kenji. Haruka's blood ran cold as the woman turned to face her, her eyes glowing with an unholy light. "You," the woman whispered, her voice echoing through the clearing. "You have come to break the curse." Haruka's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the spirit, her mind racing. "Who are you?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling. The woman stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Haruka's. "I am the spirit of this forest, bound by a curse that has lasted for centuries. My soul cannot rest until the wrongs done to me are avenged." Haruka felt a chill run down her spine as the woman's words sank in. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The spirit's eyes glowed with a fierce light as she recounted her story. "Long ago, I was betrayed by those I trusted. They took my life and left me to die in this forest. My soul was consumed by hatred and sorrow, and I cursed this land, dooming all who travel this road." Haruka's heart ached as she listened to the spirit's tale. "I want to help you," she said softly, "but I don't know how." The spirit's gaze softened slightly, and she nodded. "There is a way to break the curse, but it will not be easy. You must find the relics that bind my soul to this forest and return them to the shrine." Haruka's mind raced with questions, but before she could ask anything, the spirit began to fade. "Remember," she whispered, her voice growing faint, "the relics are hidden in the places where I suffered the most. Only by facing the past can you free us all." With that, the spirit vanished, leaving Haruka alone in the clearing. She felt a sense of determination rise within her. She had to find the relics and break the curse, not just for the spirit, but for her friends as well. As she turned to leave the clearing, she heard a familiar voice calling her name, Haruka. She spun around to see Yuta and Mika running towards her, their faces filled with relief. "You're okay," Yuta exclaimed, wrapping her in a tight hug. Mika's eyes were wide with fear as she looked around the clearing. "Where's Kenji?" Haruka's heart sank as she realized she hadn't seen him since the attack. "We have to find him," she said urgently, "and we need to break the curse." Yuta and Mika nodded, their expressions determined. Together, they set off into the forest, determined to find Kenji and the relics that would free the spirit from her torment. The forest seemed even more foreboding as they walked, the shadows growing darker and the air colder. Haruka couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the spirit was guiding them towards their goal. After what felt like hours of walking, they stumbled upon a small, abandoned village hidden deep within the forest. The buildings were old and decrepit, their wooden structures crumbling with age. Haruka felt a sense of unease as they explored the village, the air thick with the weight of the past. In the center of the village, they found a small shrine, similar to the one Haruka had seen before. It was there that they discovered the first relic, a small, intricately carved wooden amulet. Haruka felt a surge of hope as she picked it up, knowing they were one step closer to breaking the curse. But as they prepared to leave the village, they heard a low, guttural growl that sent chills down their spines. They turned to see a shadowy figure emerging from the darkness, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It was the spirit, but she was no longer the same. Her form had twisted into something monstrous, her face contorted with rage and hatred. "You will not leave this place alive," she hissed, her voice echoing through the village. Haruka's heart pounded in her chest as they backed away, their minds racing with thoughts of escape. But before they could react, the spirit lunged at them, her clawed hands reaching out with deadly intent. Haruka felt a surge of fear as she realized they were trapped, with no way to escape the spirit's wrath. In a desperate bid to protect her friends, she held up the amulet, hoping it would have some effect on the spirit. To her surprise, the spirit recoiled, her eyes widening in fear. "You have found one of the relics," she snarled, her voice filled with fury. "But you will not find the others." With a sudden, violent gust of wind, the spirit vanished, leaving Haruka, Yuta, and Mika alone in the village. Haruka felt a sense of relief wash over her, but she knew their ordeal was far from over. They had to find the remaining relics and return them to the shrine if they were to break the curse and save Kenji. Determined, they set off into the forest once more, their hearts filled with a mix of fear and hope. As they walked, Haruka couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit was watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. Haruka's thoughts were consumed with the task ahead, her mind racing with thoughts of the relics and the curse that bound them. They had to find the remaining relics and break the curse no matter the cost. With renewed determination, they pressed on, their eyes scanning the forest for any sign of the relics that would free them from the spirit's grasp. The journey was long and arduous, the forest seemingly endless, but Haruka knew they couldn't give up. Their lives depended on it. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew colder and the shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and shifting in the corner of their vision. Haruka felt a growing sense of unease as they walked, her heart pounding in her chest. The spirit's presence was ever more palpable, a constant reminder of the danger they face, but they pressed on, determined to find the relics and break the curse. Their journey took them to the darkest corners of the forest, where the air was thick with an oppressive sense of dread. They discovered the second relic hidden in the roots of an ancient tree, its bark gnarled and twisted. It was a small, intricately carved wooden figure, similar to the amulet they had found in the village. Haruka felt a surge of hope as she picked it up, knowing they were one step closer to breaking the curse. But as they prepared to leave, they heard the spirit's voice echoing through the trees. "You will not escape," she hissed, her voice filled with fury. Haruka's heart pounded in her chest as they backed away, their minds racing with thoughts of escape. But before they could react, the spirit appeared before them, her form twisted and monstrous. With a sudden, violent gust of wind, she lunged at them, her clawed hands reaching out with deadly intent. Haruka felt a surge of fear as she realized they were trapped, with no way to escape the spirit's wrath. In a desperate bid to protect her friends, she held up the wooden figure, hoping it would have some effect on the spirit. To her surprise, the spirit recoiled, her eyes widening in fear. "You have found another relic," she snarled, her voice filled with fury. "But you will not find the others." With another violent gust of wind, the spirit vanished, leaving Haruka, Yuta, and Mika alone in the cave. Haruka felt a sense of relief wash over her, but she knew their ordeal was far from over. They had to find the remaining relics and return them to the shrine if they were to break the curse and save Kenji. Determined, they set off into the forest once more, their hearts filled with a mix of fear and hope. As they walked, Haruka couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit was watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. Haruka's thoughts were consumed with the task ahead, her mind racing with thoughts of the relics and the curse that bound them. They had to find the remaining relics and break the curse, no matter the cost. With renewed determination, they pressed on, their eyes scanning the forest for any sign of the relics that would free them from the spirit's grasp. Their journey was long and arduous, the forest seemingly endless, but Haruka knew they couldn't give up. Their lives depended on it. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale, ghostly light over the forest. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the rustle of leaves underfoot. Haruka, Yuta, and Mika pressed on through the darkness, their footsteps muffled by the dense undergrowth. Each step seemed to echo with the weight of the curse that hung over them. Haruka's heart pounded in her chest, a relentless drumbeat of fear and determination. They had to find the final relic and break the curse before it was too late. The path through the forest was narrow and winding, twisting like a serpent through the shadows. The further they went, the darker and more oppressive the forest seemed to become. The trees closed in around them, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Haruka felt a chill run down her spine as she glanced around, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the vengeful spirit. They had encountered her twice already, each time barely escaping with their lives. She knew that the next encounter could be their last if they weren't careful. "Do you think we're close?" Yuta asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Haruka nodded, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "I think so. The spirit said the relics are hidden in the places where she suffered the most. We've found 3 already. The last one must be close." Mika shivered, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I just want this to be over. I want to go home." Haruka reached out and squeezed her friend's hand, offering what little comfort she could. "We will, Mika. We just have to stay strong a little longer." They continued on in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. But Haruka felt a growing sense of urgency, a feeling that they were running out of time. The spirit was growing more powerful with each passing moment, and she knew they had to act quickly if they were to save Kenji and break the curse. After what felt like hours of walking, they stumbled upon another clearing. In the center stood an ancient, weathered shrine, its wooden structure covered in moss and vines. Haruka's heart skipped a beat as she approached, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. The air around the shrine felt heavy with a palpable sense of dread, as if the very fabric of reality was warped by the curse. "This must be it," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. The final relic must be here. Yuta and Mika nodded, their expressions grim but resolute. They knew what they had to do. Together, they approached the shrine, their steps slow and cautious. Haruka reached out and pushed open the door, the old wood creaking in protest. Inside, the shrine was dimly lit by flickering candles, their flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In the center of the room, on a small altar, lay a single, intricately carved wooden box. Haruka's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the box, her hands trembling. This was it, the final relic. With a deep breath, she reached out and lifted the lid, revealing a small, delicate hairpin, its surface inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Haruka felt a surge of hope as she picked it up, knowing they were one step closer to breaking the curse. But as she turned to leave, the air in the room grew cold and the candles flickered and died. A low, guttural growl echoed through the shrine, sending chills down their spines. The vengeful spirit appeared before them, her form twisted and monstrous, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "You will not leave this place alive," she hissed, her voice filled with fury. Haruka's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, the hairpin clutched tightly in her hand. "We have to get out of here," she whispered urgently. Yuta and Mika nodded, their faces pale with fear. They turned and ran, the spirit's enraged screams echoing through the shrine. As they fled into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them, the shadows twisting and shifting in the moonlight. Haruka could feel the spirit's presence close behind, her cold breath on the back of her neck. They had to reach the main shrine and return the relics before the spirit caught them. Their footsteps pounded on the forest floor, the undergrowth tugging at their legs as they ran. Haruka's mind raced with thoughts of the curse and the relics, her heart filled with a desperate hope. They had come so far, and she refused to give up now. The path through the forest seemed to stretch on forever, but finally, they saw the Torii gate in the distance, its weathered wood glowing in the moonlight. They stumbled through the gate and into the clearing, the ancient shrine standing tall before them. Haruka felt a surge of determination as she approached the altar. The relics clutched tightly in her hands. She placed each one on the altar, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The air around them seemed to thrum with energy, the very ground beneath their feet vibrating with the power of the curse. The spirit appeared before them, her form flickering and shifting in the moonlight. "You think you can break the curse?" she snarled, her eyes glowing with fury. "You will never succeed." Haruka's heart pounded in her chest as she faced the spirit, her hands trembling. "We have to try," she said, her voice filled with determination. The spirit lunged at them, her clawed hands reaching out with deadly intent. But as she did, the relics on the altar began to glow with a soft, ethereal light. The spirit recoiled, her form flickering and fading in the light. "No," she screamed, her voice filled with rage and despair. The light from the relics grew brighter, enveloping the spirit and the shrine in a blinding glow. Haruka felt a surge of hope as she watched, her heart filled with a desperate longing for freedom. The spirit's screams echoed through the clearing, growing fainter and fainter until they were nothing more than a whisper on the wind. And then there was silence. The light from the relics faded, leaving the shrine bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. Haruka felt a wave of relief wash over her as she realized the spirit was gone. The curse was broken. They had succeeded. Yuta and Mika embraced her, their faces filled with tears of joy and relief. "We did it," Yuta said, his voice choked with emotion. Haruka nodded, her heart filled with a sense of peace. They had faced the darkness and come out victorious. But as they turned to leave, Haruka felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest. She gasped, her hands clutching at her heart. Yuta and Mika's faces filled with horror as they watched, helpless. "Haruka!" Mika cried, her voice filled with panic. Haruka fell to her knees, her vision blurring. She felt a cold, ghostly hand on her shoulder, and she knew the spirit was not gone. The curse was not broken. She had failed. With a final, shuddering breath, Haruka collapsed to the ground, her eyes closing as darkness claimed her. The last thing she heard was the spirit's mocking laughter, echoing through the night. The forest fell silent once more, the moonlight casting long shadows over the clearing. The curse remained, its grip unbroken, and the spirit watched, waiting for her next victims to wander into her domain. The forest was eerily silent, the moon casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the cool night breeze. Haruka lay motionless on the ground, her breath shallow, eyes fluttering open to the sight of Yuta and Mika's anxious faces. Her chest ached where the spirit's cold hand had touched, but she knew there was no time to waste. She had to find the strength to finish what they had started. The curse was still intact, the spirit's malevolent presence lingering in the air around them. "We have to keep moving," Haruka whispered, her voice barely audible. Yuta helped her to her feet, his expression a mix of fear and determination. "We can't give up now. We're so close." Mika nodded, her eyes wide with resolve. "But what do we do now? We've gathered all the relics, haven't we?" Haruka took a deep breath, steadying herself. The spirit said the relics must be returned to the shrine. "We need to place them correctly and recite the prayer to break the curse." The ancient prayer had been inscribed on the walls of the shrine, a final piece of the puzzle that Haruka had overlooked in her haste. They retraced their steps to the shrine, each step heavy with the weight of their mission. The forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows deeper and more menacing than before. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set their nerves on. For example, as they reached the shrine, Haruka could feel the spirit's presence growing stronger, an oppressive weight that pressed down on them. They approached the altar, the relics still glowing faintly with a supernatural light. Haruka placed the wooden amulet, the carved figure, and the mask on the altar, arranging them carefully. The final relic, the delicate hairpin, she held in her trembling hand. "We need to recite the prayer now," she said, her voice shaking. Yuta and Mika stood beside her, their faces pale but determined. Haruka began to recite the ancient words, her voice steadying as she went on. The air around them seemed to hum with energy, the relics glowing brighter with each word. As the final syllable left her lips, a sudden, violent gust of wind swept through the shrine, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. The spirit appeared before them, her form more monstrous than ever, her eyes burning with fury. "You think you can break the curse?" she snarled, her voice echoing through the shrine. "You will never succeed." Haruka felt a surge of fear but stood her ground. "We have to try," she said, her voice filled with determination. The spirit lunged at them, her clawed hands reaching out with deadly intent. But as she did, the relics on the altar began to glow with a blinding light, enveloping the spirit and the shrine. Haruka felt a surge of hope as she watched, her heart pounding in her chest. The light grew brighter, and the spirit's form began to dissolve, her screams echoing through the clearing. "No!" she screamed, her voice filled with rage and despair. Haruka watched in awe as the light consumed the spirit, her form flickering and fading until she was nothing more than a wisp of shadow. The oppressive weight lifted, and a sense of peace washed over them. The curse was broken. They had succeeded. Haruka fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Yuta and Mika embraced her, their faces filled with relief and joy. "We did it," Yuta said, his voice choked with emotion. Haruka nodded, her heart filled with a sense of peace. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but their joy was short-lived. As they turned to leave the shrine, Haruka felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest. She gasped, her hands clutching at her heart. Yuta and Mika's faces filled with horror as they watched, helpless. "Haruka!" Mika cried, her voice filled with panic. Haruka fell to the ground, her vision blurring. She felt a cold, ghostly hand on her shoulder, and she knew the spirit was not truly gone. The curse was not completely broken. With a final, shuddering breath, Haruka collapsed, her eyes closing as darkness claimed her. The last thing she heard was the spirit's mocking laughter, echoing through the night. The forest fell silent once more, the moonlight casting long shadows over the clearing. The curse remained, its grip unbroken, and the spirit watched, waiting for her next victims to wander into her domain. Haruka woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat up, the cold forest floor beneath her, Yuta and Mika by her side. "Haruka, are you okay?" Yuta asked, his voice filled with concern. Haruka took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We have to finish this," she said, her voice firm. "The relics, we missed something." Mika looked confused, but we placed them and recited the prayer. Haruka shook her head. "There's more to it. The spirit's torment must be acknowledged. We need to understand her pain and offer restitution." Yuta nodded. "How do we do that?" Haruka thought for a moment, then remembered the shrine's inscriptions. There were symbols, drawings. They might hold the key. They returned to the shrine, the oppressive air thick with anticipation. Haruka inspected the walls, her fingers tracing the ancient symbols. She found an etching of a woman surrounded by flames, another of a family bound in chains. "We need to recreate these scenes," Haruka said. "It's a symbolic act. We have to show we understand her suffering." Using twigs and leaves, they recreated the scenes on the ground before the altar. Haruka placed the relics within the makeshift drawings. Her heart heavy with the weight of their task, they stood back, the air around them humming with energy. Haruka began to recite the prayer again, this time with a deep sense of empathy and sorrow for the spirit's suffering. The relics glowed, the drawings on the ground illuminating with a soft light. A low, mournful wail echoed through the shrine, the spirit's form appearing once more. But this time, she was not monstrous. She was a sorrowful figure, her eyes filled with tears. "You understand my pain," she whispered, her voice a haunting melody. Haruka nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We do. We're sorry for what happened to you." The spirit's form shimmered, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. With a final, soft sigh, the spirit dissolved into the light, her presence lifting from the forest. The oppressive air cleared, replaced by a sense of peace and tranquility. The curse was truly broken. Haruka, Yuta, and Mika stood in the clearing, the weight of the ordeal lifting from their shoulders. They embraced, their hearts filled with relief and joy. As they left the shrine, the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, casting a warm glow over the forest. They walked back through the now peaceful woods, the sense of dread replaced by the beauty of the early morning. Birds began to sing, and the forest came alive with the sounds of a new day. Haruka felt a deep sense of accomplishment and closure. They had faced the darkness, understood its pain, and brought light to a haunted place. As they reached the edge of the forest, Haruka turned back for one last look at the shrine. The ancient structure stood tall and proud, a testament to their bravery and empathy. She knew the spirit was at peace now, her suffering acknowledged and her soul set free. Haruka, Yuta, and Mika walked on, the bond between them strengthened by their shared experience. They knew they would never forget the haunted road, the cursed forest, and the spirit who had found peace. The road trip that had started with fear and suspense had ended in redemption and understanding. And as they drove away, the forest stood as a silent witness to their journey, its shadows now a place of peace and rest. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the landscape, and the curse of the haunted road was finally laid to rest. The night was pitch black, the moon obscured by thick, rolling clouds that seemed to suffocate the sky. A thin mist hung low over the ground, twisting and turning through the dense forest that lined both sides of the narrow road. The headlights of a lone car pierced through the darkness, casting an eerie glow on the trees that seemed to close in around the vehicle. The hum of the engine was the only sound, a stark contrast to the deafening silence of the woods. Kenta and his younger sister, Yumi, were on their way back from a late night visit to their grandparents' house in a rural part of Japan. Their parents had insisted they stay overnight, but Kenta, feeling confident in his driving skills, decided to make the journey back to Tokyo. Yumi, sitting in the passenger seat, was uneasy about the drive through the forest, especially at this hour. "I don't like this, Kenta," Yumi said, her voice barely above a whisper. "These woods have always given me the creeps." Kenta glanced at her, offering a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Yumi. It's just a forest. We'll be out of here in no time." But as the road twisted and turned, the feeling of unease grew. The trees, tall and ancient, seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The mist thickened, wrapping around the car like a ghostly shroud. Suddenly, the headlights caught something on the side of the road, a fleeting glimpse of a figure, pale and gaunt, standing motionless. "Did you see that?" Yumi's voice trembled. Kenta shook his head. It was probably just a deer. This area is full of wildlife. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The figure had looked almost human, but something about it was off. Its eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to follow the car as they passed. They drove on in silence, the atmosphere inside the car growing tenser with each passing minute. The road, barely wide enough for two cars, seemed to stretch on endlessly, winding deeper into the forest. The GPS signal had long since disappeared, leaving them to rely on Kenta's memory and the old, barely readable map his grandfather had given him. "Are we lost?" Yumi asked, her voice small. Kenta sighed, his confidence waning. "No, we're not lost. Just taking the scenic route." But the truth was, he wasn't sure anymore. The road looked unfamiliar, and the further they went, the more it felt like they were being drawn into a trap. The car's radio, previously silent, suddenly crackled to life, emitting a series of strange, garbled noises. Kenta tried to tune it to a station, but all he got was static. Frustrated, he turned it off, but the sense of dread only intensified. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught another glimpse of movement, a shadow flitting between the trees. "Stop the car," Yumi said suddenly, her voice firm. Kenta hesitated. "Why?" "I need to check something," she insisted. Reluctantly, Kenta pulled over to the side of the road, the tires crunching on the gravel. Yumi stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting her like a slap. She walked a few steps into the forest, her heart pounding in her chest. Kenta watched her, his nerves on for example. "Yumi, what are you doing? Get back in the car." But Yumi didn't respond. She stood there, staring into the darkness, as if drawn by some unseen force. And then she saw it, a faint light, flickering in the distance, deep within the woods. "There's something out there," she said, her voice barely audible. Kenta got out of the car and joined her, his eyes narrowing as he tried to see what she was looking at. The light was faint, but it was definitely there, moving slowly through the trees. "Let's go back," he said, his voice tight with fear. "We shouldn't be out here." But Yumi was already moving, her feet carrying her towards the light. Kenta had no choice but to follow, his heart racing. They walked deeper into the forest, the mist swirling around their ankles. The light grew brighter, leading them further and further away from the road. Kenta tried to call out to Yumi, to tell her to stop, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. And then they reached a clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated shrine, its wooden structure rotting and covered in moss. The light they had been following was gone, leaving them in an eerie, almost unnatural silence. "What is this place?" Kenta asked, his voice barely a whisper. Yumi didn't answer. She was staring at the shrine, her eyes wide with fear and fascination. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch the weathered wood. "Yumi, don't," Kenta started, but it was too late. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, a cold wind swept through the clearing, and the air was filled with a chilling, otherworldly wail. Kenta grabbed Yumi's arm and pulled her back, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. But as they turned to leave, they realized they were no longer alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms barely visible in the dim light. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow and empty. Kenta and Yumi backed away, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The figures moved closer, their footsteps silent on the forest floor. "Run!" Kenta shouted, grabbing Yumi's hand and pulling her towards the car. They sprinted through the forest, the figures following them, their presence like a cold hand on the back of their necks. They reached the car and scrambled inside, Kenta fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and they sped away, the figures fading into the darkness behind them. As they drove, the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees bending and twisting in unnatural ways. Kenta kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Yumi was shaking, her eyes wide with terror. "That shrine. It was cursed," she whispered. Kenta nodded, his throat dry. "We need to get out of these woods. Now." But the road seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The mist grew thicker, and the sense of being watched never left them. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, it was impossible to tell. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the mist cleared, and they found themselves back on the familiar road. The lights of Tokyo glowing faintly in the distance. They drove in silence, the terror of the night still clinging to them. As they reached the city, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a pale glow on the streets. Kenta pulled over and parked the car, his hands still shaking. Yumi looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and lingering fear. "Let's never speak of this again," she said softly. Kenta nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Agreed. They sat there for a moment, letting the reality of their experience sink in. And then, without another word, they drove home, leaving the haunted woods and the horrors they had encountered far behind. But deep down, they both knew that the memories of that night would never truly fade. The shadows of the forest, the figures in the darkness, and the eerie, haunting wail would stay with them forever. A chilling reminder of the night they drove through the haunted woods. The dawn light had brought a fleeting sense of relief, but the oppressive memory of the forest clung to Kenta and Yumi like a second skin. Back in the safety of their Tokyo apartment, the siblings struggled to shake off the remnants of their harrowing night. Kenta sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a steaming cup of coffee, his mind replaying the events over and over. Yumi, pale and visibly shaken, was curled up on the couch, clutching a blanket as if it could protect her from the unseen horrors that lurked in her thoughts. Do you think we'll ever forget what happened?" Yumi's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes wide and haunted. Kenta shook his head slowly. "I don't know, Yumi. I don't know if something like that can ever be forgotten." Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, their shapes almost resembling the figures they had seen in the forest. Kenta rubbed his temples, trying to push the memories away. "We need to tell someone," Yumi said suddenly, her voice trembling but determined. Kenta looked at her, his expression conflicted. "Who would believe us? It sounds insane." "Maybe Grandpa would understand," Yumi suggested, her eyes pleading. Their grandfather had always been a storyteller, his tales often filled with supernatural elements and local legends. Perhaps he would have some insight, some way to make sense of what they had experienced. Kenta sighed, knowing she was right. "All right, let's call him." With a trembling hand, Yumi picked up the phone and dialed their grandfather's number. The line rang for what felt like an eternity, before a familiar, raspy voice answered. "Hello? Grandpa, it's Yumi. Kenta and I. We need to talk to you about something that happened last night." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a deep, thoughtful sigh. "Come over. I'll be waiting." They arrived at their grandfather's house just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. The familiar creak of the wooden steps under their feet brought a small measure of comfort. Their grandfather, a weathered old man with kind eyes and a wealth of knowledge, hidden behind his quiet demeanor, greeted them at the door. Come in," he said, ushering them inside. They sat around the old wooden table in the dimly lit kitchen, the air heavy with the scent of tea and aged wood. Their grandfather listened intently as Kenta and Yumi recounted their ordeal, his expression growing more serious with each passing detail. When they finished, he sat in silence for a moment, his eyes distant as if he were recalling some long-forgotten memory. "I was afraid this day might come," he said finally, his voice a mixture of sadness and resignation. Kenta and Yumi exchanged worried glances. "What do you mean, Grandpa?" Kenta asked. Their grandfather took a deep breath. "The forest you drove through. It's not an ordinary place. It's known as the Yuri no Mori Forest of Spirits." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Long ago, it was the site of many tragedies. Wars, famines, and countless lives lost. The spirits of those who perished there never found peace. They linger, trapped between this world and the next, unable to move on. Yumi shuddered, her mind racing back to the figures they had seen. "But why us? Why now?" "The forest has a way of calling to those who are sensitive to its presence," their grandfather explained. "It lures them in, feeding on their fear and confusion." Kenta felt a chill run down his spine. Is there a way to stop it? To make sure it doesn't happen again? Their grandfather nodded slowly. "There is a way, but it's dangerous. It requires facing the spirits directly and helping them find peace." Yumi's eyes widened. "You mean we have to go back?" Their grandfather's expression was grim. "Yes, but you won't be alone. I'll guide you as best I can. There are rituals, old ways that can help, but it won't be easy." Kenta felt a mixture of fear and determination welling up inside him. "We'll do it. We can't let this happen to anyone else." Yumi nodded, her resolve hardening. "Yes, we have to try." Their grandfather smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "Good. We'll start tonight. There's no time to waste." As night fell once more, Kenta, Yumi, and their grandfather prepared for their journey back into the heart of the forest, armed with ancient rituals and a newfound sense of purpose. They set out to confront the spirits that haunted their memories. The road to the forest was eerily familiar, the darkness seeming to close in around them even before they reached the edge of the trees. Kenta's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Yumi sat beside him, clutching a bundle of ritual items their grandfather had given her. The old man sat in the back, his presence a steadying force amidst the growing tension. As they entered the forest, the air grew colder, the mists rising once more to envelop the car. The familiar sense of unease settled over them. But this time they were prepared. They reached the clearing where the old shrine stood, its presence even more foreboding than before. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Their grandfather stepped forward, his movements deliberate and calm. He began to chant softly, the words of the ritual flowing smoothly from his lips. Kenta and Yumi followed his lead, their voices joining his in the ancient invocation. The atmosphere around them seemed to shift, the air growing colder and heavier. From the shadows, the figures began to emerge once more, their forms ghostly and indistinct. But this time, instead of fear, Kenta and Yumi felt a strange sense of empathy. These were not malevolent beings, but lost souls trapped in their own torment. Their grandfather's chanting grew louder, the words resonating with a power that seemed to reach into the very depths of the forest. The figures paused, their hollow eyes fixed on the small group. Yumi stepped forward, her voice steady. "We are here to help you find peace." The figures seemed to hesitate, their forms flickering like candle flames. Kenta joined her, his voice strong. "We know your pain. We feel your sorrow. Let us guide you to the light." The ritual continued, the air crackling with a palpable energy. The figures began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, as if drawn towards an unseen force. One by one, they approached the shrine, their forms becoming more solid, their features more human. Tears streamed down Yumi's face as she watched them, her heart aching for the suffering they had endured. Kenta felt a lump in his throat, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Their grandfather's chanting reached a crescendo, the final words echoing through the clearing like a thunderclap. The figures paused at the entrance of the shrine, their eyes meeting Kenta and Yumi's for a brief, poignant moment. Then, with a final, mournful sigh, they vanished, their forms dissolving into the mist. The air around them seemed to lighten, the oppressive weight lifting as the spirits found their peace at last. Kenta and Yumi stood in silence, their hearts heavy with the bittersweetness of their success. Their grandfather approached, his eyes filled with a quiet pride. "You did well. The spirits are at rest now." Kenta nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you, Grandpa. We couldn't have done it without you." Yumi wiped her tears, her smile tentative but genuine. "It's over. They're free." As they made their way back to the car, the forest seemed to part for them, the trees no longer looming ominously. The drive back to Tokyo was quiet, the weight of their experience settling over them like a comforting blanket. They knew that the memory of the haunted woods would stay with them, a permanent scar etched into their souls. But they also knew that they had done something important, something meaningful. They had faced the darkness and come out the other side, stronger and more resilient. And as the lights of Tokyo appeared on the horizon, they felt a sense of closure, a sense of peace that had been hard-won, but deeply deserved. The next few days passed in a blur of uneasy calm for Kenta and Yumi. Their encounter with the spirits of Yuri no more had left an indelible mark on their minds, though they had helped the spirits find peace. The fear and uncertainty lingered, casting a shadow over their daily lives. One evening, as they sat in their dimly lit living room, a sense of restlessness grew between them. Kenta gazed out the window, his mind replaying the events over and over. "We need to understand more," he said, breaking the silence. Yumi looked up from her book, her eyes weary but attentive. "What do you mean?" "We need to know why the forest is cursed, why those spirits were trapped there. Maybe then we can find some closure." Yumi nodded slowly, the determination in her brother's voice stirring something within her. "You're right. But where do we start?" Kenta stood up, his eyes bright with purpose. "We start with the history of the place. Grandpa mentioned old tragedies, wars, and famines. We need to dig deeper." Their first stop was the local library, a place of quiet solitude that offered a stark contrast to the turmoil in their minds. The musty smell of old books filled the air as they searched through archives and historical records. Hours passed, and just as they were about to give up, Yumi stumbled upon an old, dusty journal hidden at the back of a shelf. "Kenta, look at this," she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. Kenta joined her, his eyes widening as he saw the faded cover. It was a journal from the Edo period, written by a local villager. As they carefully turned the pages, the story began to unfold. The village near Yuri no more had been a prosperous place, until a series of misfortunes struck. A devastating famine, followed by a brutal war, had ravaged the land. The villagers, desperate and starving, had resorted to dark rituals, hoping to appease the spirits and bring back prosperity. But the rituals had gone horribly wrong, unleashing a curse that bound the spirits to the forest for eternity. The journal described the anguish and despair of the villagers as they realized the terrible mistake they had made. Their attempts to reverse the curse had only made things worse, trapping the spirits in an endless cycle of suffering. Kenta and Yumi exchanged grim looks as they closed the journal. "We need to find the site of the rituals," Kenta said, his voice firm. "If we can understand what went wrong, maybe we can find a way to lift the curse for good." The journey back to the forest was filled with a sense of foreboding. Armed with the knowledge from the journal, they felt a mix of hope and dread. Their grandfather had given them his blessing, but he had also warned them of the dangers they face as they approached the edge of the forest. The familiar chill in the air greeted them. The mist swirled around their feet, and the shadows seemed to whisper their secrets. Guided by the journal's descriptions, they ventured deeper into the forest, the oppressive silence pressing down on them. After what felt like hours, they finally reached a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, its surface covered in moss and weathered by time. "This must be the place," Yumi said, her voice barely audible. Kenta nodded, his eyes scanning the area. "Let's get to work." They carefully examined the altar, their fingers tracing the intricate carvings that adorned its surface. The symbols matched those described in the journal, confirming that they had found the right spot. As they began to set up for the ritual, a sense of urgency gripped them. The sun was setting, and the forest seemed to come alive. With the approaching darkness, Yumi lit the candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the trees. Kenta prepared the offerings, his hands steady despite the growing tension. They began to chant the ancient words, their voices blending with the rustling of the leaves. The air around them grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in. But they pressed on, their resolve unwavering. As the final words of the chant echoed through the clearing, a sudden gust of wind extinguished the candles. The forest fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting for a brief moment. Kenta and Yumi held their breath, waiting for a sign that the ritual had worked. But instead of the expected peace, a low, mournful wail filled the air. The ground beneath the altar trembled, and the shadows began to twist and contort, forming ghostly figures. Kenta and Yumi stepped back, their hearts pounding. The spirits, no longer bound to the forest, emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes filled with an unsettling mixture of anger and sorrow. "You cannot undo what has been done," one of the spirits said, its voice echoing with centuries of pain. "The curse is beyond your power." Despair washed over them as the spirits advanced, their forms flickering like dying embers. But just as all seemed lost, their grandfather's voice rang out from the darkness. "Stand firm, children. Do not let fear consume you." Kenta and Yumi turned to see their grandfather, his presence a beacon of hope amidst the encroaching darkness. He stepped forward, his voice strong and unwavering. "The curse may be beyond their power, but not beyond ours." With a gesture, he summoned a protective circle around them, the spirits recoiling from its light. "We can help you find peace," he continued, his eyes fixed on the spirits. "But you must let go of your anger and sorrow." The spirits hesitated, their forms wavering. "We have suffered for so long," one of them whispered, its voice filled with despair. "We know," their grandfather said gently, "and we will help you if you allow us." Slowly, the spirits began to calm, their anger fading. As they listened to his words, Kenta and Yumi joined their grandfather, their voices steady as they continued the ritual. The air around them crackled with energy, the oppressive weight lifting as the spirits' forms began to dissolve. One by one, they found peace, their anguished cries fading into the night. As the last spirit vanished, a profound silence fell over the forest. Kenta, Yumi, and their grandfather stood in the clearing, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what they had witnessed. "The curse is lifted," their grandfather said, his voice filled with quiet relief. "But remember, the forest will always hold its secrets." They nodded, understanding the weight of his words. As they made their way back through the forest, the darkness seemed less threatening, the shadows less menacing. They had faced the curse of Yuri no more and emerged stronger for it. But the memory of the spirits' suffering would stay with them, a reminder of the fragile balance between the living and the dead. Back in Tokyo, life gradually returned to normal. But the bond between Kenta, Yumi, and their grandfather had deepened. Forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal, they knew that the forest's secrets would remain with them, a part of their family's history. And as they looked towards the future, They carried with them the knowledge that even in the darkest of places, there was always the possibility of redemption and peace. The early morning mist clung to the trees like a shroud as Takashi drove back to Route 345. The road, now a familiar haunt, felt different in the pale dawn light. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a sense of anticipation. Takashi had spent the last few days piecing together the final fragments of Yuki's story. Determined to uncover the whole truth as the sun began to rise, casting a golden hue over the landscape, he reached the spot where he had first encountered Yuki. The roadside was quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional chirping of birds. Takashi parked his car and stepped out. Feeling the cool morning air on his face, he walked along the edge of the road, his eyes scanning the area for any clues he might have missed. It was here, amidst the tall grass and wildflowers, that he had found Yuki that fateful night. Now he hoped to find something that would finally put her spirit to rest. Takashi's investigation had led him to a startling discovery. Yuki's death was not just a tragic accident, or the result of her lover's betrayal. There was something more sinister at play. He had found evidence of a cover-up involving powerful people in the neighboring village who wanted to keep their secrets buried. Yuki had stumbled upon something dangerous, something that had cost her life. Determined to bring justice to Yuki and expose the truth, Takashi had gathered all the evidence he needed. He had the journal, the records from the temple, and the testimonies of villagers who had known Yuki. It was time to confront those responsible and ensure that Yuki's story was told. As he stood by the roadside, lost in thought, he heard a car approaching. It was Hiroshi, the temple priest, who had been his ally throughout this journey. Hiroshi stepped out of the car, his expression grave. "Are you ready?" he asked. Takashi nodded, his resolve unwavering. They drove together to the neighboring village, their destination a large, imposing house on the outskirts. It belonged to a man named Sato, a powerful figure who had connections to the underworld and had been involved in the events leading to Yuki's death. The house loomed ahead, its dark facade a stark contrast to the brightening sky. Takashi and Hiroshi approached the front door, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Takashi knocked, the sound echoing ominously. After a moment, the door opened, revealing Sato's stern face. "What do you want?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Takashi. "We need to talk," Takashi said firmly, holding up the journal. "It's about Yuki." Sato's expression shifted, a flicker of fear crossing his face. He stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The interior of the house was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. Takashi and Hiroshi followed Sato into a spacious living room, where they sat facing him. "What is this about?" Sato asked, his voice strained. Takashi placed the journal on the table, opening it to the final entry. "This journal belonged to Yuki's lover," he began. "It details everything he did, and more importantly, everything he knew about you." Sato's face paled as he glanced at the journal. "This is nonsense," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I have nothing to do with her death." Takashi leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Sato's. "You can deny all you want, but the truth is in these pages. Yuki found out about your dealings, and you couldn't let her expose you. You and your associates covered up her death, making it look like an accident." Sato's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "I never meant for her to die," he muttered. "She was just supposed to be scared off." "But she did die," Hiroshi interjected, his voice calm but firm. "And her spirit has been restless ever since. We're here to make sure she finds peace and to ensure that justice is served." Sato slumped back in his chair, defeated. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. Takashi took a deep breath. "First, you will confess everything. You will tell the authorities what really happened, and you will face the consequences of your actions. Second, you will fund a memorial for Yuki, a place where her family and friends can honor her memory." Sato nodded, his resistance broken. "I'll do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Takashi and Hiroshi stood up, their mission accomplished. As they left the house, Takashi felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Justice for Yuki was finally within reach. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Sato's confession made headlines, and the authorities began investigating the cover-up. Yuki's story was finally being told, and her memory was being honored. The village of Mizukawa came together to build a beautiful memorial for Yuki. A serene garden filled with her favorite flowers. Takashi attended the opening ceremony, standing beside Hiroshi and the villagers, who had come to pay their respects. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Takashi felt a sense of closure. He knew that Yuki's spirit was finally at peace. He stayed in Mizukawa for a while, helping the villagers and getting to know the people who had known Yuki. The village, once shrouded in shadows, now felt like a place of healing and hope. Takashi found solace in the simple beauty of the countryside, the gentle rustling of leaves, and the soft murmur of the river. One evening, as he walked through the village, he felt a presence beside him. He turned to see Yuki, her form translucent in the fading light. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for everything." Takashi smiled back, tears in his eyes. "You're welcome," he replied. As Yuki's spirit faded into the twilight, Takashi knew that his journey had come to an end. He had faced the shadows of the past and had brought light to a dark place. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. With a final look at the serene village of Mizukawa, Takashi set off on a new path, carrying with him the memory of Yuki and the lessons he had learned. The night was clear, the stars bright above him, guiding him forward into a future filled with hope and possibility. And so Takashi's journey continued, a journey of healing, discovery, and the unending search for truth. The haunted hitchhiker had found peace, and Takashi had found a new purpose. The road ahead was long, but he was no longer afraid. He was ready for whatever lay ahead, ready to face the darkness and bring light to those who needed it most. The rain was relentless, pounding against the windshield with a fury that turned the night into an inky blur. Takashi gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. The narrow, winding roads of the countryside seemed to stretch on forever, shrouded in darkness and mist. The only sound that pierced the night was the rhythmic thudding of the wipers and the occasional rumble of thunder. Takashi glanced at his phone mounted on the dashboard. The navigation app showed Route 345 snaking its way through the dense forest, a shortcut he often took when traveling from Tokyo to his hometown in the mountains. Tonight, the road seemed more sinister, as if the trees themselves were closing in on him. The headlights cast long, eerie shadows that danced and flickered with each turn. He adjusted his rearview mirror, noticing how the rain distorted the reflection of the empty backseat. A shiver ran down his spine. The sensation of being watched, though alone, was palpable. As he turned a sharp corner, the car's headlights illuminated a figure standing by the roadside. It was a young woman, drenched from head to toe, her hair plastered to her face, and her eyes wide with terror. She raised a trembling hand, signaling for help. Takashi's heart pounded in his chest. He hesitated for a moment, the stories of hitchhikers and highway ghosts flashing through his mind. But the sight of her desperate, pleading eyes compelled him to stop. He rolled down the window slightly, keeping the doors locked. "Are you okay?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Please," she said, her voice quivering. "I need help. My car broke down, and I've been stranded here for hours." Takashi's hesitation melted away as he saw the genuine fear in her eyes. He unlocked the passenger door and gestured for her to get in. She slid into the seat, her clothes dripping onto the floor mat. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped." Takashi nodded, his mind racing. He pulled back onto the road, driving slowly to ensure her safety. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to break the tense silence. "Yuki," she replied, her eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror. Takashi couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way she kept glancing behind them made him uneasy. He decided to focus on driving, hoping to reach a nearby town soon where she could find help. As they drove, Yuki began to speak, her voice wavering. "I was coming back from visiting my grandmother," she said, "when my car suddenly died. I tried calling for help, but there's no signal out here. I was so scared, and then I saw your car." Takashi listened, nodding occasionally. He couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. The road ahead seemed endless, the rain showing no signs of letting up. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small, dimly lit gas station. Takashi pulled in, relieved to see a lone attendant inside. "I'll wait here with you until you get help," he said, turning off the engine. Yuki nodded, her expression a mix of gratitude and lingering fear. As they walked towards the gas station, Takashi couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The night seemed to close in around them, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. Inside the gas station, the attendant, an elderly man with a weathered face, greeted them with a nod. "Got caught in the storm, huh?" he said, glancing at Yuki. She nodded, explaining her situation. The attendant made a quick call, assuring her that a tow truck would be on its way. Relieved, Takashi decided to get a cup of coffee while they waited. He poured himself a cup, the warmth a welcome comfort against the chill of the night. As he took a sip, he noticed Yuki standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. "Everything okay?" he asked, approaching her. She turned to him, her face pale. "I thought I saw something out there," she said, her voice barely audible. Takashi glanced out the window, seeing nothing but the rain-soaked parking lot. "It's probably just the rain playing tricks on your eyes," he said, trying to reassure her. Yuki nodded, but her expression remained troubled. They returned to the counter, where the attendant handed Yuki a blanket. "Thank you," she said, wrapping it around herself. Takashi checked his phone, noting that they still had some time before the tow truck arrived. The small gas station felt like a heaven amidst the storm, its fluorescent lights casting a stark contrast to the darkness outside. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the power went out. The gas station was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning. Takashi's heart raced as he fumbled for his phone, using its flashlight to navigate. "Stay close," he said to Yuki, who was clutching the blanket tightly. The attendant cursed under his breath, searching for a flashlight behind the counter. "This happens sometimes during storms," he said, his voice steady despite the situation. Takashi nodded, trying to remain calm. He directed the light around the small room, the shadows stretching and twisting in the beam. Just as suddenly as it had gone out, the power returned, the fluorescent lights buzzing back to life. Takashi let out a sigh of relief, but the uneasy feeling remained. The night seemed determined to keep them on. For example, minutes felt like hours as they waited for the tow truck. Finally, the sound of an engine approaching broke the tense silence. The tow truck pulled into the parking lot, its headlights piercing through the rain. "Looks like your ride is here," Takashi said, a sense of relief washing over him. Yuki thanked him again, her eyes filled with gratitude. She gathered her belongings, ready to leave the nightmare behind. Takashi watched as the tow truck driver, a burly man in a raincoat, helped Yuki with her car. He felt a sense of closure, knowing she would be safe. As she climbed into the tow truck, Yuki turned to wave at Takashi. A small smile on her face, he waved back, watching as the truck pulled away into the night. The rain continued to fall, but the sense of dread began to lift. Takashi finished his coffee, thanking the attendant for his help. He stepped back outside, the rain now a gentle drizzle. The road ahead seemed less menacing, and he felt a sense of accomplishment for having helped someone in need. As he got back into his car and started the engine, Takashi couldn't shake the feeling that this night would stay with him forever. The memory of Yuki's fearful eyes and the oppressive darkness of Route 345 would haunt him. a reminder of the thin line between safety and terror on these lonely roads. Little did he know, this encounter was just the beginning of a series of events that would challenge his perception of reality and test his courage in ways he could never have imagined. Takashi couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that lingered. Long after the storm had passed, days turned into weeks, and the memory of Yuki and that fateful night on Route 345 haunted him. He found himself unable to forget her terrified eyes and the eerie sense of being watched one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon. Painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, Takashi decided to take the same route again. Perhaps revisiting the place would help him find some closure. The road was eerily familiar, the dense forest on either side, casting long shadows as night fell. The memory of the rain-soaked night replayed in his mind, each detail vivid and haunting. As he drove, Takashi noticed something odd. The gas station where he had taken Yuki seemed to be missing. In its place was an old, abandoned building, overgrown with vines and looking as though it hadn't been used in years. Confused, he pulled over and got out of the car. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Takashi approached the building, the wooden sign creaking in the wind. It was clear that no one had set foot there in a long time. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized that the place he remembered from that night didn't exist anymore, or maybe never had. His mind raced with questions. Had he imagined the whole thing? Was Yuki real? Determined to find answers, Takashi decided to investigate further. He drove to the nearest town and checked into a small local inn. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with kind eyes, greeted him warmly. "Can I help you with something?" she asked as Takashi signed the guest book. "Yes," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm looking for information about Route 345 and the gas station that used to be there." The innkeeper's expression changed, a hint of concern flickering in her eyes. "You must be talking about the old gas station," she said softly. "It's been abandoned for years. People say it's haunted." Takashi felt a chill run through him. "Haunted?" he echoed. The innkeeper nodded, her gaze distant. "There are stories about a young woman who died on that road many years ago. Some say she still wanders there looking for help." Takashi's heart pounded in his chest. Could it be that Yuki was the ghost people talked about? He needed to know more. "Do you know what happened to her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The innkeeper sighed, her eyes filled with sadness. "Her name was Yuki," she began. "She was driving home one night when her car broke down. She was stranded in the rain, just like you described. A passerby found her the next morning, but it was too late. She had died of exposure, alone and frightened." Takashi's mind reeled. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but it only raised more questions. Had he truly encountered a ghost that night? Determined to uncover the truth, Takashi thanked the innkeeper and returned to his room. He needed to gather more information to piece together the events of that night. The next day, Takashi visited the local library, poring over old newspapers and records. He found an article about Yuki's death, dated several decades ago. The details matched what the innkeeper had told him. His hands trembled as he read about the tragic incident. Yuki's photo stared back at him from the faded newsprint. Her eyes filled with the same fear he had seen that night. The realization hit him hard. He had indeed encountered Yuki's spirit. Determined to put her soul to rest, Takashi decided to visit her grave. The cemetery was a quiet, somber place, the tombstones weathered by time. He found Yuki's grave, a simple stone marker adorned with flowers and incense. Kneeling before the grave, Takashi offered a silent prayer. He hoped that by acknowledging her and understanding her story, he could help her find peace. As he stood up to leave, a soft breeze rustled the leaves around him, and he felt a sense of calm wash over him. It was as if Yuki's spirit was finally at rest. Takashi returned to his car, a heavy weight lifted from his shoulders. The road ahead seemed less daunting, the shadows less menacing. He knew that he had done the right thing, helping a lost soul find peace. But as he drove away from the cemetery, a nagging feeling remained. Had he truly seen the last of Yuki? Or was there more to her story? The mystery of that night on Route 345 still lingered, and Takashi couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with the haunted hitchhiker was far from over. The road stretched out before him, winding through the forest like a dark ribbon. Takashi resolved to keep searching for answers, determined to uncover the truth behind the haunted hitchhiker and the secrets that lay hidden on Route 345. As he drove, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Takashi knew one thing for sure. He would not rest until he had unraveled the mystery that haunted his every thought. With a steely determination, he continued down the dark, winding road, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the tranquil village of Mizukawa. Takashi stood by the edge of the river, watching the water glisten in the fading light. The beauty of the scene contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside him. He had returned to the village where Yuki had once lived, driven by an unrelenting need to understand more about her life and the mysterious circumstances surrounding her death. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers, a reminder of the life that continued despite the haunting memories of the past. Takashi walked along the narrow path that led to the heart of the village, his footsteps echoing in the quiet evening. The villagers greeted him with polite nods, their faces a mix of curiosity and wariness. It was a small, close-knit community, and outsiders were a rarity. He found his way to the local temple, a place where he hoped to find some answers. The temple was old, its wooden structure weathered by time and the elements. Takashi climbed the stone steps, each one seeming to carry him further into the past. Inside, he was greeted by the temple priest, a man named Hiroshi. Hiroshi was in his late 60s, with a kind yet solemn demeanor. He listened patiently as Takashi explained his quest, his eyes filled with understanding. "Yuki's spirit has been restless for many years," Hiroshi said softly. "She was a kind and gentle soul, but her death was a tragedy that left many questions unanswered." Takashi nodded, feeling a deep sense of empathy for the young woman, whose life had been cut short. "Can you tell me more about her?" he asked. Hiroshi led Takashi to a small room at the back of the temple, where old records and photographs were kept. He handed Takashi a faded photograph of Yuki, her smiling face a stark contrast to the fear he had seen that night on Route 345. "Yuki was beloved by everyone in the village," Hiroshi began. "She was always helping others, always cheerful. But her death, it left a shadow over this place." Takashi listened intently as Hiroshi recounted the events leading up to Yuki's death. It was a rainy night, much like the one Takashi had experienced. Yuki had been driving home after visiting her grandmother when her car broke down on Route 345. Despite her attempts to get help, she was found the next morning, lifeless and cold. "There were rumors," Hiroshi continued, his voice lowering to a whisper. "Rumors that Yuki's death was not an accident. Some say she was running from something or someone." Takashi felt a chill run down his spine. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but they painted a picture far more sinister than he had imagined. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tense. Hiroshi sighed, his eyes filled with sorrow. Yuki had been seeing a man from a neighboring village, a man with a dark reputation. There were whispers that he was involved in some shady dealings, and that Yuki had discovered something she shouldn't have. Takashi's mind raced. Could this man be the reason for Yuki's restless spirit? He thanked Hiroshi for his help and left the temple, determined to uncover the truth. The next morning, Takashi drove to the neighboring village. It was a quiet, unassuming place, much like Mizukawa. He began asking around, trying to find out more about the man Yuki had been involved with. It wasn't long before he found someone who knew him. He was a troublemaker, an elderly woman told Takashi. Always getting into fights, always up to no good. Yuki was too good for him. Takashi's investigation led him to a small house. On the outskirts of the village, the house looked abandoned, its windows boarded up, and the garden overgrown with weeds. Takashi approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of decay. Takashi's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a scene of chairs. Furniture was overturned, papers were scattered everywhere, and the walls were covered in strange symbols. As he moved deeper into the house, Takashi felt a growing sense of dread. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on him, whispering secrets he couldn't quite hear. In a small room at the back of the house, Takashi found what he was looking for: a journal half buried under a pile of rubble. He picked it up and began to read. The journal belonged to Yuki's lover, and it detailed his descent into madness. He wrote about the things he had done, the people he had hurt, and the dark forces he had tried to summon. Takashi's hands shook as he read the final entry. It was a confession. The man had discovered Yuki's plan to expose him, and in a fit of rage, he had sabotaged her car. He never meant for her to die, but when he realized what he had done, he fled, leaving her to her fate. Takashi felt a surge of anger and sorrow. Yuki's death had been preventable, a result of one man's selfishness and cruelty. He knew what he had to do. Takashi took the journal and returned to Mizukawa. He went straight to the temple and handed it to Hiroshi. "This is the truth," he said, his voice trembling. "Yuki deserves justice." Hiroshi nodded, his eyes filled with resolve. "We will perform a ceremony to put her spirit to rest," he said. "Her story must be told, and her soul must be freed." The ceremony took place that evening. The villagers gathered at the temple, their faces solemn as Hiroshi recited ancient prayers. Takashi stood by Yuki's grave, the journal clutched in his hands. As the ceremony reached its climax, Takashi felt a sense of peace wash over him. The air was filled with the scent of incense, and the soft glow of lanterns illuminated the temple grounds. It was as if the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when Yuki's spirit would finally be at peace. As the final prayer was spoken, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, and Takashi felt a presence beside him. He turned to see Yuki, her face serene and free of the fear that had haunted her in life. She smiled at him, a look of gratitude in her eyes. Takashi felt tears welling up as he watched her fade away, her spirit finally at rest. The villagers began to disperse, their faces reflecting a sense of relief and closure. Hiroshi approached Takashi, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," he said softly. "You have given Yuki the peace she deserved." Takashi nodded, his heart heavy but filled with a sense of accomplishment. He knew that his journey was not yet over, but he had taken the first step in uncovering the truth and bringing justice to a lost soul. As he walked away from the temple, the night sky clear and filled with stars, Takashi felt a renewed sense of purpose. The shadows of the past had been illuminated, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The road before him was long and winding, but he was no longer alone. He carried with him the memory of Yuki and the knowledge that he had done the right thing. And with that, he continued his journey, determined to uncover the remaining secrets and bring peace to those who had been wronged. The early morning mist clung to the trees like a shroud as Takashi drove back to Route 345. The road, now a familiar haunt, felt different in the pale dawn light. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a sense of anticipation. Takashi had spent the last few days piecing together the final fragments of Yuki's story, determined to uncover the whole truth. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden hue over the landscape, he reached the spot where he had first encountered Yuki. The roadside was quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional chirping of birds. Takashi parked his car and stepped out, feeling the cool morning air on his face. He walked along the edge of the road, his eyes scanning the area for any clues he might have missed. It was here, amidst the tall grass and wildflowers, that he had found Yuki that fateful night. Now he hoped to find something that would finally put her spirit to rest. Takashi's investigation had led him to a startling discovery. Yuki's death was not just a tragic accident or the result of her lover's betrayal. There was something more sinister at play. He had found evidence of a cover-up involving powerful people in the neighboring village who wanted to keep their secrets buried. Yuki had stumbled upon something dangerous, something that had cost her life. Determined to bring justice to Yuki and expose the truth, Takashi had gathered all the evidence he needed. He had the journal, the records from the temple, and the testimonies of villagers who had known Yuki. It was time to confront those responsible and ensure that Yuki's story was told. As he stood by the roadside, lost in thought, he heard a car approaching. It was Hiroshi, the temple priest, who had been his ally throughout this journey. Hiroshi stepped out of the car, his expression grave. "Are you ready?" he asked. Takashi nodded, his resolve unwavering. They drove together to the neighboring village, their destination a large, imposing house on the outskirts. It belonged to a man named Sato, a powerful figure who had connections to the underworld and had been involved in the events leading to Yuki's death. The house loomed ahead, its dark facade a stark contrast to the brightening sky. Takashi and Hiroshi approached the front door, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Takashi knocked, the sound echoing ominously. After a moment, the door opened, revealing Sato's stern face. "What do you want?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Takashi. "We need to talk," Takashi said firmly, holding up the journal. "It's about Yuki." Sato's expression shifted, a flicker of fear crossing his face. He stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The interior of the house was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. Takashi and Hiroshi followed Sato into a spacious living room, where they sat facing him. "What is this about?" Sato asked, his voice strained. Takashi placed the journal on the table, opening it to the final entry. "This journal belonged to Yuki's lover," he began. "It details everything he did, and more importantly, everything he knew about you." Sato's face paled as he glanced at the journal. "This is nonsense," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I have nothing to do with her death." Takashi leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Sato's. "You can deny all you want, but the truth is in these pages. Yuki found out about your dealings, and you couldn't let her expose you. You and your associates covered up her death, making it look like an accident." Sato's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "I never meant for her to die," he muttered. "She was just supposed to be scared off." "But she did die," Hiroshi interjected, his voice calm but firm. "And her spirit has been restless ever since. We're here to make sure she finds peace and to ensure that justice is served." Sato slumped back in his chair, defeated. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. Takashi took a deep breath. "First, you will confess everything. You will tell the authorities what really happened, and you will face the consequences of your actions. Second, you will fund a memorial for Yuki, a place where her family and friends can honor her memory." Sato nodded, his resistance broken. "I'll do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Takashi and Hiroshi stood up, their mission accomplished. As they left the house, Takashi felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Justice for Yuki was finally within reach. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Sato's confession made headlines, and the authorities began investigating the cover-up. Yuki's story was finally being told, and her memory was being honored. The village of Mizukawa came together to build a beautiful memorial for Yuki, a serene garden filled with her favorite flowers. Takashi attended the opening ceremony, standing beside Hiroshi and the villagers, who had come to pay their respects. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Takashi felt a sense of closure. He knew that Yuki's spirit was finally at peace. He stayed in Mizukawa for a while, helping the villagers and getting to know the people who had known Yuki. The village, once shrouded in shadows, now felt like a place of healing and hope. Takashi found solace in the simple beauty of the countryside, the gentle rustling of leaves, and the soft murmur of the river. One evening, as he walked through the village, he felt a presence beside him. He turned to see Yuki, her form translucent in the fading light. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for everything." Takashi smiled back, tears in his eyes. "You're welcome," he replied. As Yuki's spirit faded into the twilight, Takashi knew that his journey had come to an end. He had faced the shadows of the past and had brought light to a dark place. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. With a final look at the serene village of Mizukawa, Takashi set off on a new path, carrying with him the memory of Yuki and the lessons he had learned. The night was clear, the stars bright above him, guiding him forward into a future filled with hope and possibility. And so Takashi's journey continued, a journey of healing, discovery, and the unending search for truth. The haunted hitchhiker had found peace, and Takashi had found a new purpose. The road ahead was long, but he was no longer afraid. He was ready for whatever lay ahead, ready to face the darkness and bring light to those who needed it most.